Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we are traveling somewhere quiet, somewhere ordinary, somewhere most history books forget to look. We are not going to a battlefield or a palace. We are going to a small brick bungalow on a snowy street in a Canadian town, sometime around the middle of the 1950s, where a woman is about to spend an entire day doing something history has quietly decided was not worth recording. Running a home. If you have trouble sleeping, this is the place for you. There will be no explosions tonight, no dramatic reveals, no cliffhangers. There will only be porridge, cold floors, wet laundry, and a great deal of quiet, patient endurance. So settle in, turn the lights down low, and let your mind drift back 70 years to a kitchen that is just beginning to stir in the dark. Before we step inside, let's set the scene properly, because the 1950s in Canada were a strange and particular decade to be alive in, especially if you were a woman. The war had ended a few years earlier, and with it had ended a brief, unusual chapter in which women had run factories, driven trucks, and kept the country working while the men were overseas. When the soldiers came home, that chapter was closed, gently but firmly, and women were guided back toward the kitchen with a great deal of cheerful propaganda, telling them this was where they had always belonged and always wanted to be. The country itself was changing shape. New suburbs were spreading out from every major city, rows of nearly identical bungalows built quickly and sold cheaply to young families starting out. The birth rate was climbing to levels the country had never seen before or since. A demographic wave historians would later name the baby boom. Automobiles, refrigerators, washing machines, and eventually televisions were arriving in ordinary homes for the first time, marketed as miracles that would finally give the housewife a life of ease. We will spend tonight discovering exactly how much ease that turned out to be. Picture your house for a moment. It is modest, freshly built, part of a long row of nearly identical homes on a street that did not exist 5 years ago. There is a coal or oil furnace in the basement, a wringer washing machine down there beside it, a small refrigerator in the kitchen that is considered the height of modern luxury, and a radio in the corner that will keep you company for most of the day. Upstairs, several small bedrooms are packed with children, because 4, 5, or 6 children is not unusual for this street. It is simply what a family looks like. You are the woman of this house. Let's say you are 31 years old, married for 8 years, mother to 4 children ranging from a 6-month-old baby to a boy of 7 who is already losing his front teeth. Your husband works downtown at an insurance office, or perhaps a factory or a bank. It hardly matters which, because his job, whatever it is, ends at 5 o'clock. Yours does not end at all. It is not yet 5 in the morning, and you are already awake, because the baby has decided that sleep is a concept for other people. Let's begin there in the dark, because that is genuinely where every single one of your days begins. The house is silent except for the baby, who has moved from a soft whimper to a determined, rhythmic cry that will not stop until someone attends to it, and that someone, as always, is you. Your husband sleeps on beside you, undisturbed, because in the arrangement of this household his sleep is protected in a way yours simply is not. He has an office to be sharp for. You, apparently, do not require sharpness, only stamina. You swing your legs out from under the quilts, and your bare feet meet a floor so cold it feels almost personal, as though the house itself is testing your resolve before the day has even properly started. The furnace in the basement has been quietly losing its battle against the night for hours, and by 5 in the morning the whole house has settled into a deep, stubborn chill that will not lift until you go downstairs and feed the fire yourself. You pull on a dressing gown and slippers not for comfort, but because the alternative is genuine physical suffering, and you pad down the hallway in the dark, counting the familiar creaks in the floorboards the way sailors count stars. There is no thermostat you can simply nudge upward from the warmth of your bed. There is no glowing digital display, no phone to check. There is only the fact of the cold and the fact that it is your job to fix it, along with everything else that will go wrong today. You reach the baby's room and lift the small, furious bundle into your arms, and for a moment in the near total darkness, you simply stand there swaying, feeling the particular exhaustion that comes from broken sleep stacked on top of broken sleep, night after night, for months on end. Nobody warns you, before you have children, that exhaustion can become a permanent condition rather than a temporary state. You carry the baby down to the kitchen because a warm bottle needs warming, and warming anything in this house means lighting a stove. Let's talk for a moment about your body, because your body in 1955 is not entirely your own, at least not in the way we might think of it today. It has borne 4 children in 8 years, and it will very likely bear at least one more before the decade is finished, because reliable birth control is difficult to obtain and family planning, as a phrase, barely exists in polite conversation. Your back aches in a low, constant way that you have simply stopped noticing, the way you might stop noticing a persistent hum. Your hands are chapped from cold water and rough soap. You are, by any reasonable modern standard, extremely tired, but tired is not a word available to you today. Today you are simply a housewife, and this is simply Tuesday or Thursday or any day at all, because they are all in their essentials, the same day repeated with small variations. You strike a match, light the stove, and set a small pan of milk to warm. And while it heats, you stand in the dark kitchen looking out the window at a street with not a single light on in any other house. Somewhere out there, on this same street, in nearly identical kitchens, other women are almost certainly doing exactly what you are doing right now, alone, awake, and unacknowledged. It is a strange kind of company, knowing you are not really alone in your solitude. Now, before the rest of the household stirs, you have perhaps 40 minutes to transform yourself from the exhausted woman standing at the stove into the composed, presentable wife who will greet the day. This transformation is not optional, and it is not quick. Let's begin with what goes on underneath everything else, because in 1955 getting dressed is closer to construction work than to simply pulling on clothes. There is the girdle first. A stiff elasticated garment that you wrestle up over your hips with real physical effort, designed to smooth your silhouette into the narrow, controlled shape the era considers proper. It is snug enough that breathing deeply takes a small conscious effort, and you will wear it, tightened around your ribs and hips, for every waking hour of the day ahead, including the hours spent scrubbing floors. Then come the stockings. Sheer nylon that ladders if you so much as glance at it wrong, clipped carefully to a garter belt, because bare legs in public are simply not done, and a run in your last good pair is a genuine domestic emergency. You roll each stocking up with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for handling something breakable, because in a sense it is. A fresh pair costs real money, and money, as we will discuss later tonight, is not entirely yours to spend. Your hair was set the night before, wound tightly onto hard curlers you somehow managed to sleep on, and now you unwind it, brush it into soft waves, and pin it into the neat, wholesome style the magazines insist every respectable wife wears before 9 in the morning. A little lipstick follows, applied with a steady hand despite having been awake for hours, because a well-groomed face is understood, in this particular culture, to be a kind of courtesy you owe your household and, frankly, anyone who might happen to see you. By the time you catch your own reflection in the hallway mirror, 40 minutes have vanished, and you are looking at a composed, polished stranger who bears very little resemblance to the exhausted woman who woke in the cold an hour ago. Your first task of the day, the one that will actually occupy the next several hours, is scrubbing a kitchen floor on your hands and knees. Nobody watching that particular chore will care in the slightest that your hair is set and your lipstick is fresh. And yet it must be done anyway, because appearances, we will find, matter enormously in this world, even when there is no audience at all beyond a toddler and a percolator. Speaking of the percolator, it has been quietly doing its work this whole time, and the smell of coffee is now beginning to drift through the house, which means the rest of the family will be stirring soon, and breakfast, the first of what will feel like several hundred meals you produce this week alone, needs to begin. Pause the story here for just a moment, because I want you to notice something about the pace of this life. It moves in these small, overlapping tasks, one bleeding into the next, so seamlessly that there is genuinely no clear boundary between one chore ending and another beginning. There is no version of this day that includes a coffee break, a lunch hour, or a moment when a supervisor says, "That's enough for today, go home." This is home. There is nowhere else to go. We will continue in a moment with the great production of breakfast, the frantic choreography of getting a husband out the door looking sharp and well fed, and then the small army of children who must be dressed, mittened, and marched off into a Canadian winter morning. For now, let the cold kitchen and the smell of percolating coffee settle into your mind, and rest here a moment before we move on. Let's return to that kitchen, warm now with the smell of coffee and the first gray light beginning to creep in around the frost on the window pane. The baby has been fed and set down in a corner with a wooden spoon to occupy her, and now the real work of breakfast begins, because in this house breakfast is not a slice of toast eaten standing at the counter. It is a full production, and you are its sole engineer. Start with the porridge, because in a Canadian household in the 1950s, porridge is treated less like a food and more like a strategic necessity. The children have a long, cold walk to school ahead of them, through drafty streets in a winter that does not care how young they are, and a bowl of buttered oatmeal is considered the only reasonable defense against the cold and the long morning ahead. You stand over the pot stirring the thick gray mixture so it does not catch and burn on the bottom, adding a spoon of brown sugar for the ones who complain, a splash of cream skimmed from the top of the milk bottle for the ones who don't, and you have made this exact pot of porridge perhaps 3,000 times already in your married life, and you will make it 3,000 times more before the youngest child leaves for good. While the porridge simmers, the bacon goes into a heavy cast iron pan, and within minutes that smell alone is enough to summon every half-asleep person in the house down to the kitchen table, drawn by instinct the way animals are drawn by scent. You crack the eggs directly into the bacon fat, because in 1955 nobody has yet decided that this is unhealthy, and everybody at this table is delighted about it. The toast is its own separate, smaller battle, made one slice at a time under a broiler, because the pop-up toaster remains, for your household at least, a luxury still sitting on a page of the mail-order catalog rather than on your own counter. You must watch each slice like a hawk, because a moment's distraction produces a piece of blackened charcoal rather than toast, and a piece of charcoal means starting again from scratch while the rest of the meal grows cold waiting for you. By the time everyone is seated, you are somehow simultaneously the cook, the waitress, and the referee. One child refuses the yolk of his egg and pushes it to the side of the plate with visible suspicion. Another wants more sugar in her porridge and says so loudly enough that the whole table hears it. Your husband likes his eggs a very particular way, a preference that seems to shift slightly from week to week depending on his mood, and he will comment, gently but audibly, if today's effort does not quite match his memory of yesterday's. The baby, meanwhile, has discovered that porridge makes an excellent projectile, and a good portion of her breakfast ends up on the floor, on the wall, and once, memorably, in her own hair. You pour coffee, refill the milk jug, wipe up a spill before it can spread, catch a spoon before it clatters to the floor, and somewhere in the middle of all this motion, your own plate sits quietly at the far end of the table, largely untouched and steadily cooling. This is simply how breakfast works in your house. You are technically also a diner at this meal, but only in the loosest, most theoretical sense. In practice, you eat standing at the stove, a few forkfuls snatched between crises, and your coffee, made fresh not 20 minutes ago, is already lukewarm by the time you manage 3 sips of it. This particular small disappointment, lukewarm coffee, will in fact repeat itself at nearly every meal you eat for the next 20 years, though you have not yet had cause to count quite that far ahead. Eventually, mercifully, the plates begin to empty and the family starts to scatter from the table, leaving behind a small disaster zone of crumbs, smears of egg yolk, and abandoned crusts of toast that nobody quite finished. You survey it for a brief moment, The first battlefield of the day already cleared, though of course not actually cleared at all, merely observed, because it still needs washing, and it is not yet 7 in the morning. Now comes what might fairly be called the great mourning ceremony of this household, the departure of your husband, an event treated with a formality that would suit a small royal procession. His shirt, which you washed, wrung, and pressed the night before until the collar sat crisp as new paper, is already laid out and waiting. His shoes, somehow, are never quite where he left them, and a brief search always precedes his exit. His lunch, packed by your hands into a metal box or a folded paper bag, is prepared with a level of care that would not be out of place in a far more ceremonial tradition. Sandwiches wrapped neatly in wax paper, perhaps a slice of yesterday's cake, a thermos of hot coffee or soup depending on the season. Consider the shirt for a moment, because it represents something larger than fabric. A man whose collar is limp or graying is understood, by the unwritten rules of the neighborhood, to reflect badly not on himself but on his wife. And so a small, invisible piece of your own reputation walks out the front door on his back every single morning, and nobody but you will ever know how many hours of ironing, starching, and careful pressing it took to get that collar to sit just so. You help him into his coat, straighten his tie without quite being asked to, and receive in return a brief, slightly distracted kiss on the cheek, the kind of gesture performed more from habit than from any deliberate thought. He collects his hat, his newspaper, and the lunch you packed, and steps out into the cold morning air, off to catch the streetcar or the early train that will carry him downtown, to an office where he will be greeted as Mr., thanked for his contributions, and permitted, at some point around noon, to sit down uninterrupted and eat a meal he did not have to cook himself. Here is the quiet unfairness sitting underneath this whole small ceremony, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. His working day has a beginning and an end. It starts when he walks through the office door and it finishes cleanly when he walks back out of it. In between, he is one man doing one job, with in all likelihood a coffee break and a colleague or two to complain to. Your working day has no such shape at all. It has no starting whistle and no closing bell, no lunch hour, and certainly no colleague standing beside you at a shared sink, sharing the load or the complaint. He is, in the truest sense, a visitor to this house, arriving each evening and departing each morning. You are a permanent resident of the very workplace you can never actually leave, not even for an afternoon, not even for an hour. The front door closes behind him, and for exactly half a second the house exhales into silence, and you stand there for that brief, precious moment with a cooling cup of coffee in your hand. Then, right on cue, a small voice calls out from somewhere down the hallway to report that something has been spilled, and the next stage of the morning begins in earnest, because the children, however much you might privately wish otherwise, are not going to deliver themselves to school. This is the era historians would later name the baby boom, and your household, with its 4 children under the age of 8, is not remarkable in the slightest. On this street alone, there are homes with 5 children, homes with 6, and nobody blinks twice at the number. Getting them all fed, dressed, and pointed in the same direction at the same time is less like ordinary parenting, and rather more like directing a small and chaotic transportation network, one in which several of the vehicles are actively arguing about whose turn it is to wear the good mittens. The dressing itself, especially now in the depths of a Canadian winter, is a serious operation in its own right. From roughly October through to April, no child leaves this house for school without being encased in a full layered system of undershirt, shirt, sweater, snow pants, coat, scarf, toque, and mittens. The mittens threaded on a length of string through the coat sleeves precisely because loose mittens vanish with an almost supernatural reliability. You work your way down the line of children like a small quartermaster equipping soldiers for a campaign, zipping each one up to the chin, stepping back to inspect your work, and it is at precisely this moment, without fail, that the smallest one announces an urgent need for the bathroom, requiring the entire careful assembly to be undone and rebuilt from the very beginning. And then, of course, There is the matter of the missing mitten, an event so reliable it might as well be scheduled into the calendar. Somewhere in this house there exists a drawer, a basket, a designated place where mittens are meant to live between uses, and yet at the precise moment of departure that place is somehow always empty. You are down on your knees checking under furniture, patting down coat pockets, interrogating small suspects who all claim total innocence, because a child cannot walk to school in a Canadian winter morning with bare hands, full stop, no exceptions. Eventually, through some combination of persistence and sheer stubborn will, the children are dressed, fed, and gathered by the front door, a wobbling row of small, overstuffed parcels who can no longer fully lower their arms to their sides. There is no line of cars waiting at the curb, no supervised walking bus, no adult escort beyond the older children keeping half an eye on the younger ones. You send them off in a loose pack with the neighborhood kids, calling out a final warning about watching for traffic, and you watch them trudge off down the snowy sidewalk until they disappear around the corner toward a school that will, without question, undo every bit of that careful grooming by lunchtime. You close the front door on the last of them, and the house drops into a silence so sudden and complete that it almost has a sound of its own. For one shimmering moment, nobody needs anything from you at all. Nobody is crying, spilling, or hunting for a lost mitten. You could, in theory, sit down right here in the hallway and simply rest. You will not do this, of course, because that silence is not an invitation to rest. It is the sound of a cluttered, unswept house quietly waiting its turn, and behind you in the kitchen, the wreckage of breakfast has already begun collecting a fine layer of cold grease, patient and entirely unbothered by the passage of time. We will pause here for a moment, and in our next part we will step properly into that kitchen, and into the long, physical work of scrubbing this house into the kind of order the era expects of you, floor by floor, room by room, on your hands and knees. Let's step back into that kitchen now, because the silence has already begun to feel less like peace and more like a held breath, and there is a great deal of work standing patiently on the other side of it. Keeping a home spotless in this era is not simply a matter of tidying up after breakfast. It is closer to a moral obligation, one you did not exactly agree to but inherited all the same, passed down from your mother, reinforced by every women's magazine on the rack at the drugstore, and quietly enforced by the neighbors, who notice far more than they ever say out loud. Survey the battlefield for a moment before you begin, because it helps to understand the full scope of what you are facing. Behind you in the kitchen sits the wreckage of breakfast, a table dusted in crumbs, a counter smeared with egg and butter, a floor already scattered with the particular debris only a 1-year-old can generate. Down the hallway, the beds sit unmade, blankets thrown back in a tangle, sheets waiting to be pulled taut and tucked into the sharp hospital corners the magazines insist every proper bed should have. In the front room, ashtrays need emptying, cushions need plumping back into shape, and the carpet has collected an entire morning's worth of foot traffic, coal dust drifting up from the basement, and general household grime that seems to accumulate no matter how carefully you try to prevent it. Begin with the floors, because the floors are, without question, the great humbling task of this house. There is no cordless vacuum gliding politely along the baseboards on its own, no spray mop that lets you stand upright while you work. There is a bucket of hot water, a bar of yellow soap, a stiff brush, and your own 2 knees pressed against the cold linoleum. You work in sections, dipping the brush, scrubbing in small determined circles, wringing out gray water that seems to darken faster than seems reasonable, working the corners and the edges along the baseboard by hand because no mop ever quite reaches into a corner, the way your own fingers can. The ammonia in the cleaning water is sharp enough to sting your eyes if you lean too close, and your knuckles, by the time you finish even one room, have gone raw and pink from the hot water and the friction. When you finally sit back on your heels to survey a finished room, there is a brief, genuine satisfaction in seeing the floor gleam, clean and wet, catching the light from the window. That satisfaction lasts, on a good day, perhaps 20 minutes, because by the time you have moved on to scrub the next room, the first has usually already begun collecting fresh footprints from a returning toddler who has no interest whatsoever in your morning's labor. Here is the part of this task that makes it heavier than the hours alone would suggest. A dirty house in this era is never treated as simply a neutral fact of a busy life. It is treated, quietly but unmistakably, as a verdict on your character. A woman whose front step is unswept, whose windows are streaked, whose front hallway carries the faint smell of yesterday's cooking, is understood by the neighbors, by your mother-in-law, and by the small persistent voice the magazines have installed inside your own head, to be somehow lacking. Lazy, perhaps, or careless, or simply not trying hard enough. Cleanliness has been fused so tightly to virtue in this culture that every smudge on a windowsill seems to carry a small, invisible charge of shame. And the standard you are meant to meet is, by any honest measure, impossible. The photographs in the magazines show homes where nothing is ever out of place, where no toddler has ever flung a spoonful of porridge and no husband has ever left a damp towel on the bathroom floor. You are meant to aspire toward that gleaming, entirely fictional interior while actually living inside a house with 4 small, energetic tornadoes, and a furnace that coats every surface in a fine film of coal dust by evening. It is a bit like being asked to keep an entire beach permanently free of sand. You can work with total sincerity from sunrise until supper, and by the time your husband walks back through the front door, the house will have quietly undone a good portion of what you accomplished, ready to demand precisely the same performance again tomorrow. So you tie your apron a little tighter, refill the bucket, and continue because the alternative, a house simply left to its own devices, is not something this era permits you to consider. You will dust the shelves, smooth the bedspread, sweep the hallway, wipe down every surface in the front room, and by the time you finish, the house will look, for a few private hours at least, genuinely lovely. Almost certainly nobody will comment on it, because a clean house in this world is invisible. Only a dirty one ever gets noticed. Now, having spoken of daily cleaning, we need to speak of something considerably larger, because if the ordinary daily upkeep of this house is a small skirmish, then Monday is a full and unavoidable battle. Monday, by a kind of unwritten and unbreakable law observed on nearly every street in the country, is wash day, and doing the laundry in 1955 is a genuine, occasionally dangerous physical ordeal rather than the simple matter of pressing a button that it will one day become. Let's understand first why it must be Monday specifically, because the rigidity of the schedule matters. The week in this household, and in nearly every household on this street, runs according to a fixed and shared rhythm. Wash on Monday, iron on Tuesday, and so on down through the week, a pattern followed with such consistency that to wash your clothes on, say, a Wednesday would be read by the neighbors as a small, telling sign of a disorganized household. And so Monday it is, every single week, arriving with all the cheer of a dreaded appointment you cannot reschedule. Down in the basement waits the machine itself, a wringer washer, a heavy tub that churns your family's clothing through hot soapy water while 2 tight rollers sit mounted on top, waiting to squeeze the water back out of each garment before it can be rinsed and hung to dry. You fill the tub with water hauled or piped in and heated specially for the purpose, add the soap flakes, and let the machine agitate the load into a churning gray soup. And this is only the first act, because the far more demanding part of the job is still ahead of you. The wringer itself deserves real respect, because it is not a gentle piece of equipment. You feed each wet garment by hand into the narrow gap between the 2 rollers, and they seize it and pull it through, flattening it out on the far side like something out of a slapstick film, except there is nothing remotely funny about the danger involved. Every woman on this street either knows firsthand or has heard secondhand of a moment's inattention, a sleeve caught, a hand pulled too close, an arm dragged in after it before the release lever could be reached in time. You feed shirt after shirt, sheet after sheet, towel after towel through those rollers with a kind of weary, practiced vigilance, watching your fingers the entire time, aware that the machine cannot tell the difference between a pillowcase and a thumb, and will not slow down to find out. And then there is simply the volume of it all, because a large family produces an almost unbelievable quantity of dirty laundry every single week. Work shirts, school clothes, bedsheets, towels, and cloth diapers by the dozen, since disposable ones barely exist yet, and what does exist is far too costly for a household on your budget. You are not doing a single load this morning. You are doing load after load, hauling baskets of wet fabric that weigh 2 or 3 times what they did dry, your back protesting with every lift, the basement thick with steam and the sharp metallic smell of hot water against old iron pipes. By the time the final load has been washed, wrung, and rinsed, the entire morning is gone, your arms feel like jelly, and you are damp to the elbows and beyond. And here comes the truly Canadian cruelty layered on top of all this effort, because now every single piece of that freshly washed laundry has to actually dry, in a country that spends roughly half the year doing its very best to freeze water solid rather than evaporate it. Picture the summer version of this task first, because it is genuinely, unreservedly pleasant, and you will want to hold on to the memory of it to get through what comes next. On a warm day, you carry the heavy wicker basket out to the yard, peg each item to the line, and let the sun and the breeze do, entirely for free, what a machine one day will charge you handsomely to do. The sheets billow gently, the shirts snap and flutter, and everything that comes back inside carries that particular sun-warmed, outdoor smell that no bottle of detergent has ever quite managed to replicate. For a few short months of the year, laundry day is almost, something to look forward to. Then autumn arrives and tightens its grip, and the whole enterprise turns strange and difficult. You step outside in your heaviest coat, your breath fogging in front of you, your fingers stiffening painfully around the wooden clothespins, and you hang the wet wash into biting, bitter cold. It does not dry in any ordinary sense of the word. It freezes solid. The water still held inside the fabric turns to ice, and within the hour your husband's long underwear has become a rigid, man-shaped plank standing stiffly on the line. The bedsheets turn into great pale sails of solid ice, clattering faintly against each other in the wind like the flattened ghosts of your entire family standing guard over the yard. You unpeg these frozen effigies one by one and carry them indoors like awkward, oversized boards, where they will slowly thaw over the course of the day, and finally, eventually, finish drying properly. It is a kind of accidental freeze-drying, performed entirely by hand, entirely unpaid, because there is simply no other option available to you. Bringing the laundry inside to finish drying, of course, means the house itself now pays a price. Every chair back, every clothes rack, every spare door frame and radiator in the house becomes a temporary drying surface, draped with damp shirts and slowly thawing towels, and the rooms fill with a heavy, soapy dampness that seems to linger for days at a time. You duck under sagging lines strung across the kitchen, thread your way through a small maze of half-dried garments hanging at head height, and breathe air thick enough, on the worst days, that you half expect something to start growing in it. Getting a large family's laundry properly dry through a Canadian winter is not a single afternoon's task at all. It is a slow, patient, all-consuming occupation that quietly colonizes every warm corner of your home for days on end. You know perfectly well, of course, that a solution to all of this exists, because you have seen it sitting proudly in the pages of the mail-order catalog. An electric clothes dryer, a gleaming white box that promises to take your sodden laundry and return it warm, soft, and fully dry within a single hour. No frost, no frozen underwear standing sentry in the yard, no damp maze strung through the kitchen. It sits there on the page, taunting you gently, right beside a price tag that represents a genuinely significant chunk of the household's weekly budget. Money that, as we will discuss later tonight, is already spoken for several times over before it ever reaches your hands. So the dryer remains, for now, a distant dream, a small glowing symbol of a future you cannot yet quite afford, one in which Monday does not slowly bleed into Wednesday. For the present, you make your peace with the frost, the drape, and the perpetual dampness, telling yourself, not entirely untruthfully, that at least the fresh air leaves everything smelling pleasant, even the frozen version of fresh air. You pull the last stiff sheet off the line, fingers aching from the cold, and haul it inside to begin its long thaw, and you remind yourself, with a certain grim humor, that everything you have just spent 2 full days washing and drying is now thoroughly and hopelessly wrinkled, and tomorrow, without fail, is ironing day. We'll rest here for a moment, letting that thought settle, before we move into the long hours at the ironing board, the daily riddle of what to put on the supper table, and the great cruel joke hiding behind every shiny new appliance in your kitchen. Wash day has a cruel and entirely predictable sequel, and its name is ironing day, because clothing that comes off a line, whether sun-dried in July or freeze-dried in January, arrives back inside your house stiff, wrinkled, and thoroughly uncooperative. Nearly everything must be pressed back into submission before it can be considered fit to wear or fit to be seen, and I do mean nearly everything. Shirts, dresses, trousers, tea towels, pillowcases, handkerchiefs, and yes, even your husband's undergarments, because apparently a rumpled undershirt somehow reflects poorly on the household as a whole, even though not a single living soul beyond the two of you will ever see it. Let's begin with the sheer scope of the list, because the list itself is the real horror of the day. In a much later era, ironing will shrink down to nothing more than the occasional dress shirt hauled out in a panic before an important meeting. In your house, in this decade, ironing is an entire category of daily existence in its own right. You press the shirts, of course, but also the bed sheets, the pillowcases, the tablecloths, the tea towels, the handkerchiefs, and the children's small clothes, garments whose only audience for the rest of their existence will be the inside of a folded dresser drawer. You are, quite literally, ironing things that no living person outside this family will ever lay eyes on, purely because the standard of the era does not concern itself with logic. It only concerns itself with the standard. The iron itself is a serious tool, a heavy wedge of solid metal heated on the stove or plugged directly into the wall, and using it well is a genuine skill, one you have spent years quietly perfecting without ever thinking of it as a skill at all. Heat it too much and you scorch the fabric, leaving behind a faint yellow-brown ghost of a mistake on a white collar, ruining the garment and wasting the whole effort in one careless moment. Heat it too little, and the wrinkle simply refuses to budge, unimpressed by your best efforts. You keep a small bowl of water close at hand to sprinkle over stubborn fabric, letting the dampness help the heat do its work, and you move through each piece in a fixed, practiced order. Collar first, then cuffs, then the yoke across the shoulders, then the sleeves, then finally the long, unbroken stretches of the body of the garment. It is a whole small choreography, repeated for a single shirt, and then repeated again for the next, and the next, dozens of times over before the pile beside you finally begins to shrink. And then there is the heat itself, which becomes its own separate trial depending entirely on the season. In summer, the kitchen turns into something close to an oven, and you stand at the ironing board with sweat gathering at your temples, your carefully set hair slowly wilting in the humidity, pressing hot cotton in an already hot room with a hot iron in your hand, silently wondering why the universe arranged the timing of this chore quite so poorly. In winter, at least, the extra warmth from the iron is almost a small mercy in an otherwise cold house. But regardless of the season, the work itself is done standing, for hours at a stretch, your shoulder and forearm aching from the steady, repetitive press and lift and slide, the ironing board wobbling slightly with each pass, the pile of unfinished clothing refusing to shrink quite as quickly as you would like. Here is the quiet, almost comic insult buried inside the whole task. A great deal of what you iron so carefully today will be worn, sat in, slept on, or wiped with, and thoroughly wrinkled again within a single day of ordinary living. The smoothness you fought so hard to achieve is undone by nothing more dramatic than an afternoon of your family simply existing. You press a bedsheet to a flawless finish, fully aware that it will be crumpled the very moment someone climbs into bed and falls asleep on it. You iron a handkerchief whose entire purpose in life is to be sneezed into. It is, in a real sense, labor poured carefully into objects specifically designed to undo that labor almost immediately. A Tuesday spent, quite literally, fighting entropy with a heavy piece of hot metal, a fight that entropy, it must be said honestly, will always eventually win. But you finish, because you always finish. The great chaotic pile of wrinkled fabric slowly becomes neat, folded stacks of crisp order. And for a brief shining moment, the linen closet looks like something out of one of those glossy magazine photographs, and your husband's shirts hang ready and sharp on their hangers, prepared for tomorrow. You unplug the iron, flex your aching hand, and survey a job finished well, and as always, entirely invisibly, because nobody in this house is going to walk past that closet and comment on how beautifully pressed the pillowcases happen to be. And you might, for one brief, hopeful moment, allow yourself to believe that all these wondrous new machines humming away in your kitchen and basement exist purely to lighten your load. Which brings us directly to what might fairly be called the great cruel joke of this particular decade. You might reasonably assume, looking around at the marvels now filling ordinary homes across the country, that modern appliances have made life genuinely easier for a woman in your position. And here is the quiet, cruel twist hiding underneath all of it. Yes, you have a shiny new refrigerator humming contentedly in the corner of the kitchen. Yes, you likely have a proper gas or electric range rather than an old wood stove, and perhaps even a vacuum cleaner that has let you retire the old carpet beater for good. These machines are genuine marvels, advertised endlessly as your ticket to a life of leisure, ease, and pearls. But look closely at what actually happened once they arrived in your home, because the machines did not lower your total workload in any meaningful way. Instead, quietly and almost invisibly, they simply raised the standard you were expected to meet. Take the refrigerator as our first example, that proud white box purring away in the corner. It is, without question, a genuine wonder. No more daily trips to the Iceman, no more anxious worry over whether the milk has turned sour by noon. A cold, clean, dependable place to keep the family's food safe. And yet notice what it quietly did to your daily life in return for that convenience. Because you can now safely store a wider variety of food, you are now expected to keep a wider variety on hand at all times, to plan more elaborate and varied meals across the week, to always have the makings of a proper hot supper ready regardless of the day. The machine solved one genuine problem, and, in the very same breath, quietly handed you 3 brand new expectations to meet. The bar, as it turns out, never simply stays where it was. The vacuum cleaner tells almost exactly the same story from a different angle. Once, not so long ago, a rug was carried outdoors and beaten across a line perhaps 2 or 3 times a year. A hard, sweaty job, certainly, but only an occasional one, and a bit of everyday dust worked into the carpet fibers was simply accepted as an ordinary part of life. Now you own a machine that hums smoothly across the floor and lifts the dirt right out of the pile in a matter of minutes, which sounds like an unambiguous gift right up until you follow the logic to its natural conclusion. Because the carpet can now, technically, be kept spotless, the carpet is now expected to be spotless every single day, rather than a few times each season. The vacuum did not free up your afternoon at all. It simply filled that same afternoon with a brand new daily task that did not previously exist, all while a bright, cheerful advertisement somewhere insisted you were being thoroughly pampered by the very machine now adding to your list. This same pattern repeats itself behind nearly every gleaming appliance sold to women of your generation. The washing machine made clothes genuinely easier to clean, and so clothes were now washed far more frequently, and a shirt worn twice in a row was suddenly considered slightly unacceptable, where once it would have gone entirely unremarked. Improved cleaning products made a truly clean house achievable, and so a merely tidy house quietly stopped being good enough, and only an immaculate one would do from now on. Each and every labor-saving device saved labor in theory, while manufacturing brand new labor in practice, because the very moment a task became easier to perform, the definition of a job well done simply leapt further out of reach, staying permanently one careful step ahead of you. And the advertising surrounding all of this deserves its own honest mention, because it is relentless. Every magazine page shows some radiant, impossibly composed woman in a spotless dress gazing at her new appliance with something bordering on genuine romantic devotion. Freed at last, the copy promises for a life of ease, pleasure, and quality time with the children. The message is warm, endlessly repeated, and when you actually examine it against your own daily reality, completely upside down. The technology itself is entirely real and genuinely useful, but the promised leisure it was meant to deliver never quite arrives, because that leisure was never truly the point of the exercise in the first place. The real point, quietly and gradually, was a rising standard of domestic perfection that reliably consumes whatever small amount of time the machines manage to give back to you. So here you stand in your thoroughly modern kitchen, surrounded by marvels your own grandmother could never have dreamed of owning, working every bit as hard as she did, quite possibly harder, and being told, with a bright reassuring smile from every glossy page and radio advertisement, precisely how easy your life has become. The appliances hum along steadily in the background, the standards climb a little higher every year, and you, standing at the very center of this shining, mechanized household, have simply been handed better tools and, in that very same breath, quietly informed that you have run entirely out of reasonable excuses. Which is, admittedly, a rather bitter place to pause, so let's turn our attention now to something more immediately practical, because at some point every single day, someone in this household has to actually go out and acquire the food, and that someone, without exception, is you, on foot, in whatever weather the sky has decided to provide, carrying a list and a budget that rarely see eye to eye. Depending on exactly where in the country you live, this errand takes one of two rather different shapes. In the older, more established version, still common in many towns, you walk into the corner grocer's shop, hand your written list across the wooden counter, and the grocer himself moves along the shelves behind him, gathering your items one by one, weighing out the flour, slicing the cheese to your requested thickness, wrapping the fresh meat carefully in brown paper tied with string. He knows your name, your family, your habits, and very possibly a good deal more about your household's business than you would strictly prefer. He may keep a running tally in a ledger under the counter, settled up at the end of the week or the month, a small personal kindness, and also a small personal trap, because a bill you cannot watch growing day by day is a bill that has a quiet tendency to grow rather larger than you expected. In the newer, faster-growing towns and cities, however, a genuinely novel idea is beginning to spread. The self-serve supermarket, where you take up a cart or a basket and, astonishingly, select your own items directly from open shelves rather than having them fetched for you. This still strikes many people as a strange and thoroughly modern development. The idea that a shopper should be permitted to wander freely up and down the aisles, handling the goods herself, comparing prices side by side, choosing entirely for herself rather than relying on a shopkeeper's judgment. The shelves in these newer stores are stacked high with tins, boxes, and packages, bright competing labels shouting for your attention from every direction. And you move through it all doing careful arithmetic in your head at every turn, because the household budget is always watching over your shoulder, and every single choice becomes a small, quiet negotiation between what you would like to buy and what you can actually afford to. The reason you find yourself making this particular trip so often, several times a week rather than the once-a-month shopping trip a much later generation will take entirely for granted, comes directly back to that small humming refrigerator in your kitchen. It keeps food cold and safe, certainly, but it is not especially large, and a proper full-sized freezer remains, for most households on your street, a genuine luxury rather than a standard fixture. You cannot meaningfully stockpile. You buy fresh meat, fresh milk, and fresh vegetables only in the quantities your family will realistically consume before spoilage sets in, which means the entire errand repeats itself endlessly, a steady rhythm of small, constant resupply. Meal by meal, day by day, you function as the sole supply line for an army of hungry people, and that supply line runs entirely on your own 2 feet. And here is the detail that turns this simple errand into something closer to a genuine physical ordeal. You are, almost certainly, doing all of this without access to a car. Most households on this street own, at most, a single automobile, and your husband has already taken it downtown to the office, leaving it parked in a lot several miles away for the rest of the day, while you stand out here in the cold with your list. So you walk, carrying a heavy bag or 2 in your arms, perhaps a small child balanced on one hip at the same time, hauling everything home along snowy, uneven sidewalks, and if the load proves too large to manage in one trip, you simply come back and do it all again tomorrow. The glossy advertisements show a smiling, effortless woman gliding a full cart toward a waiting station wagon parked conveniently by the door. You are, in reality, the woman trudging home on foot with a flour sack balanced against a toddler, and you would genuinely trade a great deal for that station wagon parked so casually in the advertisement. You finally reach your own front step, arms aching, and set the bags down carefully to fish the house key out from somewhere in your coat pocket. The food, at long last, is home. Now, of course, somebody has to actually turn all of it into an edible, balanced, and reasonably attractive meal, which turns out to be a considerably larger puzzle than it first appears. We'll pause here for a moment before continuing into the daily riddle of meal planning, the strange and genuine national obsession with the jellied salad, and the long, hot, physically demanding ritual of canning and preserving for the winter ahead. Getting the groceries home, as it turns out, is only half the battle, because before a single pot can go on the stove, you first have to solve the daily riddle of exactly what to make, and this particular puzzle is a far bigger undertaking than it might sound from the outside. You are feeding a large family 3 times a day, every single day, on a tight and unforgiving budget, using a limited set of ingredients, and somehow you must manage all of this while keeping the meals varied enough that nobody at the table complains, and nutritious enough that the magazines never have cause to make you feel ashamed of your efforts. Your 2 great authorities in this ongoing campaign are a well-worn cookbook, its pages soft and stained from years of use, and the reliable monthly women's magazine sitting on the side table, which dispenses recipes, full weekly meal plans, and a steady, gentle drip of expectation as though feeding a family well were the simplest thing in the world. Consider, for a moment, the true scope of this problem, because it is relentless in a way a single fancy dinner party could never come close to matching. This is not one meal you are planning tonight. It is 3 meals a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, for a household of hungry, opinionated people, indefinitely, with no repeat obvious enough to draw a complaint from anyone at the table. Do the rough arithmetic in your head, as you so often find yourself doing, and it comes out to something in the neighborhood of 1,000 separate meals every single year passing through your hands alone, each one requiring its own decision, its own shopping consequence, its own cooking effort, and its own cleanup afterward. It is, in every meaningful sense, a logistics operation that never actually closes for the season, and you are, quite simply, the entire planning department all by yourself. Now layer the household budget on top of that already considerable challenge, because money is always, without exception, the hard ceiling above everything you decide to cook. You are not planning the meals you might genuinely enjoy making. You are planning the meals you can actually afford to make, stretching the cheaper cuts of meat across several days, building the week's menu around whatever happens to be in season and on sale at the moment, saving the good roast specifically for Sunday, and then finding 6 clever, resourceful ways to repurpose whatever is left over so that nothing at all goes to waste. Waste, in this household, sits very close to an actual sin. So today's boiled potato quietly becomes tomorrow's fried potato. Sunday's roast chicken becomes Monday's soup, and the carcass after that becomes stock for something else entirely. You are planning not merely the meals themselves, but the afterlives of those meals, thinking several moves ahead like a careful, patient strategist, working with nothing more dramatic than a leftover chicken bone. And then, layered on top of both the variety and the budget, comes the growing modern concern with proper nutrition. Because the era has recently discovered, with great enthusiasm, that food is a genuine science, and it has quietly decided that you are the household's resident scientist. The magazines and the government pamphlets alike preach endlessly about the essential food groups, the importance of daily balance, the necessity of sufficient vitamins and protein, and the particular importance of a proper hot meal in raising strong, healthy children through a genuinely cold country. You are meant to deliver meals that are simultaneously cheap, varied, visually attractive, and nutritionally sound, all at once, hitting every single requirement like a trained nutritionist somehow working within the confines of a modest diner's budget. And you are meant to accomplish all of this so smoothly and effortlessly that it looks, from the outside, as though no real thought went into it whatsoever. So you sit for a quiet moment with the shopping list, the open magazine, and the household arithmetic spread out in front of you, planning the coming week the way a careful general might plan a campaign, carefully balancing money against nutrition, nutrition against variety, variety against the strong and stubborn preferences of several very small tyrants who each have firm and non-negotiable opinions about supper. It is invisible, entirely unpaid, genuinely demanding intellectual labor, and not one single person in this household will ever think to call it that. They will simply, quietly expect a proper supper on the table. And speaking of supper, the day is beginning to turn now, the light outside growing thinner and colder, and the single most closely scrutinized meal of the entire day is drawing steadily closer. Supper in this house must be hot. It must be sitting on the table, fully ready, at the precise moment your husband walks back through the front door. And it must, ideally, look at least a little like something pulled directly from the pages of a magazine advertisement. This is, in every real sense, the golden age of the casserole, of the honest roast dinner, of the carefully boiled vegetable, and above and beyond all of it, the strange and enduring national reign of the jellied salad. Yes, this really is the era in which a perfectly ordinary, sensible woman is expected to suspend shredded carrot, tinned peaches, or, on occasion, tuna fish and celery, directly inside a wobbling, brightly colored mold of flavored gelatin, and then present the finished result proudly to her family as a salad. Let's begin with the timing of the meal itself, because supper is genuinely a performance with a hard, unmovable curtain time. It must be ready, hot, and fully assembled at the exact moment your husband steps through the door, which means you spend the entire late afternoon in a careful, practiced choreography of pots, pans, and timing. The roast resting under foil, the potatoes finishing at just the right moment, the vegetables cooked through but not yet gone soft, everything reaching its peak all at once like a small, carefully choreographed culinary display. Get any part of the timing wrong and either the meat turns dry, or your husband is kept waiting at the table, and either outcome, fairly or not, is understood by everyone in the household to be your failing alone to answer for. The food itself sits at a genuinely interesting crossroads of the era's changing tastes. On one side there is the honest, hearty cooking of a cold northern country. Roasts, stews, pork chops, potatoes served in every conceivable form, vegetables boiled with a thoroughness that a much later generation of cooks would find rather alarming. On the other side sits the rapid rise of the casserole, that wonderfully practical invention that allows you to stretch a modest amount of meat across an entire hungry family with the help of a single tin of condensed soup and a crisp topping of something crunchy. One dish, one oven, and one small, quiet prayer that it comes out well. We must speak seriously, and at some length about gelatin, because no honest account of the era's dinner table would be complete without it. The flavored gelatin dessert has, by the middle of this decade, escaped the dessert course entirely and staged what can only be described as a full and confident takeover of the main meal itself. And the results, viewed with any distance at all, are genuinely, delightfully baffling. Women right across the country are suspending all manner of ingredients in wobbling, jewel-toned molds and calmly calling the finished result a salad. Shredded cabbage and carrots suspended in a vivid lime green, tinned fruit floating gently in orange, and in the era's boldest and most confident moments, entirely savory creations holding tuna, celery, olives, or shrimp, all trapped forever inside a quivering, translucent dome. It is bright, it is genuinely jiggly, it is presented at the table with total, unwavering sincerity, and it stands as, somehow, both a genuine triumph of new refrigeration technology and a small, gentle crime against food itself. Why exactly did this happen? Blame, in part, the marketing departments of the gelatin companies. Blame the new home refrigerator, which finally made a properly set mold achievable in any ordinary kitchen. Blame the era's deep, sincere love of anything that looked modern, engineered, and neat. A perfectly unmolded gelatin salad, gleaming and intact on the serving plate, said something quiet and important about the hostess who made it, that she was capable, current, entirely in command of the latest kitchen techniques available to her. And so women across the country poured real skill, real patience, and real effort into these shimmering, slightly absurd monuments. And you will make them too, following the recipe printed carefully in the magazine, and you will set the trembling finished mold on your own table with genuine, sincere pride. And here, quietly, is the small comedy sitting at the very heart of the meal. You have spent the better part of the afternoon planning, shopping, timing, and cooking. A hot, carefully balanced, genuinely attractive supper, crowned proudly with a salad that defies most ordinary laws of nature. And the family will sit down, eat the entire meal in roughly 15 minutes flat, offer perhaps a single grunt of approval if you are fortunate, and then scatter back to their own evenings. The gelatin, remarkably, will be eaten without a single question ever being asked about it, because questioning the jellied salad, on some quiet, unspoken level, feels rather close to questioning the entire social order it represents. You will smile, begin clearing the plates, and start in on the dishes, because before we move on from the kitchen entirely, we still need to talk about where a good portion of tonight's food actually came from in the first place, and the long, sweaty, late summer ritual that put it safely in your pantry. Because when the garden comes in, or the local market fills up with a sudden glut of ripe produce, especially out on the farms and in the smaller towns scattered across the country, you do not simply eat it as it comes. You save it, methodically and deliberately, because winter is coming, and the grocery bill, as always, is a genuine and pressing concern. So you spend the tail end of every summer and a good stretch of the following autumn, standing in a hot kitchen, blanching, peeling, chopping, and sealing jar after jar of tomatoes, beans, pickles, jams, and fruit. Understand first, before we get to the labor itself, exactly why anyone would willingly take on a task this demanding, and the honest answer is fairly simple and fairly Canadian. The winter here is long, fresh produce all but vanishes from the shelves for months at a stretch, and the grocery budget simply cannot carry a large family all the way through to spring relying solely on store-bought tins. So when the tomatoes ripen all at once, when the beans come flooding in from the garden, when the fruit at the market is briefly cheap and genuinely abundant, you seize that narrow window and put it up properly, transforming a fleeting, temporary glut into row upon row of sealed jars that will quietly feed your family straight through the frozen months ahead. It is thrift, careful foresight, and genuine survival, all dressed up together as a kind of quiet domestic art, and out on the farms especially, it is not remotely optional. A full, well-stocked cellar in October is a warm and comforting feeling come February. Now to the labor itself, because it is, quite honestly, genuinely brutal work. Preserving means heat, and a great deal of it, because everything involved must be boiled at some stage. The produce blanched first, the jars themselves sterilized in boiling water, and then the sealed, filled jars processed again in a large canner of furiously bubbling water to finish the job properly. So you find yourself doing all of this during the very warmest weeks of the year, standing over a stove that steadily turns your entire kitchen into something resembling a furnace, steam fogging every window in the room, sweat soaking straight through the back of your dress. Your hands scalded and stained deep red and purple from hours of peeling and chopping mountains of vegetables and fruit. Picture running a small, entirely self-contained factory inside a sauna for the better part of several days running, and you begin to grasp something close to the real texture of a proper preserving season. And then there is the pressure cooker itself, that hissing, rattling presence sitting on the stove, genuinely essential for safely preserving low-acid vegetables, and regarded by nearly every woman who uses one with a healthy, well-earned mixture of respect and outright fear in roughly equal measure. It sits there under real pressure, its small metal valve jiggling and shrieking steadily as it builds up a considerable head of steam, and everyone on this street knows, either firsthand or through a story passed along at the coffee table, that a neglected or faulty lid can, on occasion, let go with genuinely spectacular and thoroughly messy consequences. Nearly every woman of this generation has her own story, or knows a close friend who does, about a pressure cooker lid that blew clean off and redecorated an entire kitchen, sealing with stewed tomatoes in a single dramatic instant. You keep a careful, weary eye on it the whole time, in much the same way you keep a weary eye on the wringer washer down in the basement, another household machine that helps you enormously while quietly, constantly threatening to hurt you if you look away for even a moment too long. The sheer volume of the finished work is genuinely staggering as well, because you are not putting up a modest half-dozen decorative jars for some small farmer's market table. You are laying in an entire winter's supply for a large, hungry family. Dozens upon dozens of jars filled with tomatoes, beans, peas, and corn, pickles of every conceivable kind, relishes and chutneys, jams and jellies made from the summer's fresh berries, applesauce, and whole canned peaches and pears. It is production on a genuinely industrial scale, carried out entirely by hand, in your own modest kitchen by you alone, over the course of several long, hot, repetitive weeks that leave your lower back permanently aching and your fingernails stained for months afterward. But then, eventually, it is finally, genuinely done, and you stand quietly in the cool of the cellar afterward, surveying the shelves you have filled, and the feeling that settles over you is real and thoroughly earned. Row upon row of glass jars glow softly in the dim cellar light, deep ruby red, warm gold, and rich forest green, a small fortress of stored food standing ready against the coming cold, every single jar filled entirely by your own two scalded hands. It is, genuinely, a magnificent achievement. It very nearly killed you to accomplish it, and that particular cold you have just spent weeks preparing for is no longer some distant, theoretical thing on the calendar. It is already here, pressing in against the windows, which means it is well past time to talk honestly about the daily, ongoing war required simply to keep this house warm enough to survive it. We will pause here for now, and pick back up shortly with the coal furnace waiting patiently in the basement, the strange, half-private world of the shared telephone party line, and the delicate, unspoken question of who actually controls the household's money. Let's address now the quiet, constant battle running underneath every other task of this day, because keeping this house warm through a proper Canadian winter is, in its own right, a full job all by itself, one that runs entirely separately from the cooking, the cleaning, and the endless laundry we have already spent so much time discussing tonight. Down in the basement sits the furnace, A great hulking iron creature with thick pipes reaching upward through the whole structure of the house like the outstretched arms of something slumbering and patient. It runs on coal, or in some newer homes on oil, and it demands regular, reliable attention throughout the day, attention that, in theory, ought to belong to your husband, but that in practice falls almost entirely to you, because the fire itself does not know or care that he is away at the office until 5 o'clock. If your furnace burns coal, and a great many still do in this decade, then someone in the household must physically shovel that coal into its glowing mouth several times a day, keeping the fire fed and steady without letting it die down into cold ash. And once the fire has done its work, someone must also rake out and haul away the spent ash and clinker left behind, a heavy, genuinely dirty task that produces a fine, gritty black dust settling over everything nearby. Because your husband is gone from early morning until supper time, and because a dying fire in January cannot politely wait for his return, the shoveling, the stoking, and the ash hauling all become, quietly and by default, one more item on your own already overflowing list. The coal itself carries its own small ongoing saga. It arrives by delivery truck and is dumped into a storage bin down in the basement, a dark, dusty mountain that seems to work its fine black grit into absolutely everything nearby, drifting into the air, settling on shelves, even finding its way onto laundry you thought you had already hung safely out of reach. Tending the fire properly means descending into that gloom several separate times over the course of a single day, feeding it just enough to keep the house comfortably above misery, without burning through the winter's coal supply too quickly, because coal costs real money, and that supply has to last until spring arrives. It is a bit like keeping a large, somewhat temperamental animal alive down in your own cellar, one that will happily let your family freeze if you neglect it for too long, and will just as happily bankrupt the household if you feed it too generously. Now consider, for a moment, exactly how that hard-won warmth actually distributes itself through the house once you have it, because the honest answer is, rather badly. Heat rises and drifts wherever it pleases, largely ignoring your preferences on the matter, so the rooms closest to the furnace itself, along with the kitchen where the stove is often working as well, stay comfortably warm, occasionally even a little stifling, while the bedrooms further off and the rooms upstairs remain stubbornly, persistently cold no matter how hard the furnace works below. The children sleep piled beneath heavy quilts and wear thick socks to bed as a matter of routine. You get dressed each morning standing in whichever room happens to be warmest, then dash quickly through the colder ones, and over time every member of this household develops an intimate, almost instinctive map of the house's particular warm spots and cold spots, gravitating naturally toward the good chair nearest the heat the way a cat instinctively finds the single patch of afternoon sun. Beyond simply feeding the fire, there are also the seasonal defenses you mount each year against the cold, actively trying to work its way inside. An annual campaign waged directly against the very structure of the house itself. Every autumn you and your husband wrestle the heavy storm windows into place over the regular ones, adding an extra protective layer of glass against the wind. And you stuff rolled towels and old rugs against the bottom of doors to block the drafts that persistently sneak in around every frame. And still, despite all of it, the cold finds a way through, seeping slowly in through the walls and around the window frames, so that on the very worst mornings the water left standing in the kettle overnight wears a thin skin of ice by dawn, and delicate feathers of frost bloom thick across the inside of the window panes, genuinely beautiful to look at and thoroughly unwelcome all the same. So you keep the fire steadily fed, the drafts carefully blocked, and the family properly bundled against the chill, waging a slow, constant, largely invisible war against a climate that would, quite honestly, freeze you all where you sat given even half a chance. It is exhausting, entirely unrelenting work, and like nearly everything else discussed tonight, it is simply expected of you as a matter of course, noticed by absolutely no one unless it happens to fail. You climb back up the basement stairs at last, brushing the fine black coal dust from your hands as best you can, and just as you catch your breath, the telephone in the front hallway gives its own particular, distinctive ring, and you brace yourself slightly before answering, because the telephone in this house, as it happens, is never entirely private. Let's talk properly about the telephone now, because it is about to become both a genuine lifeline for you and, simultaneously, a source of low-grade, ongoing paranoia. If you live in a smaller town or out on a farm, there is a very good chance your telephone line is a shared party line, meaning your household's connection runs along the same wire as several neighboring households at once. When you lift the receiver to place a call, you might well find Mrs. Henderson 3 doors down already deep in conversation, and simple courtesy demands that you quietly hang up and try again a little later. Though, of course, being entirely human, quite a few people on the line are also gently, discreetly listening in whenever they get the chance. Let's begin with how the whole arrangement actually works, because it is genuinely stranger than a modern ear might easily believe. Your telephone line is not truly yours alone at all. The single wire running to your house is shared among several nearby homes, all wired together onto the same connection, meaning that at any given moment the line might already be occupied by someone entirely unrelated to your own household. Each household on the shared line is assigned its own distinctive ring pattern, a specific sequence of long and short rings, so that whenever the telephone sounds, you listen carefully to the particular pattern to know whether the call is actually meant for you or for one of your several neighbors sharing the same wire. Which brings us, rather inevitably, to the matter of eavesdropping, the quiet, open secret sitting at the very heart of every party line in the country. When the phone rings for someone else's household, proper etiquette says you are meant to simply ignore it entirely. You are also, being an ordinary human being with entirely ordinary curiosity, genuinely tempted at times to gently lift the receiver and listen in for just a moment. Everyone on the line knows this happens regularly. Nearly everyone does it, at least occasionally. You learn over time to speak carefully on your own calls, always assuming a silent audience somewhere along the wire, because the small piece of news you shared privately with your sister about your husband's recent raise or a neighbor's smart new coat will somehow reliably reach half the street by supper time, having quietly traveled the wire through the ears of listeners who would insist, if asked directly, that they were absolutely not listening. The etiquette surrounding all of this is genuinely elaborate and carries its own quiet tension. If you pick up the receiver intending to make a call and find the line already occupied, courtesy demands that you hang up immediately and try again sometime later. Courtesy also demands, in return, that you not stay on the line too long yourself once it is your turn, because others down the street are very likely waiting their turn as well. But courtesy and simple human nature are old, familiar rivals, and there is nearly always one particular neighbor, on every shared line, who happily ties the connection up for the better part of an hour gossiping away, while 2 or 3 other households wait impatiently with calls of their own to make. You develop firm, well-considered opinions about your various line mates over time, based almost entirely on their telephone manners, a whole small social hierarchy quietly conducted over a single shared wire. And yet, despite the obvious lack of any real privacy, the telephone remains a genuine and important gift in your daily life, because your days out here, whether in the new suburb or further out on a farm, are lonely in a way that is genuinely hard to overstate to anyone who has not lived it. With your husband gone at the office all day, and the neighbors largely occupied behind their own closed front doors, the telephone becomes a thin but real thread connecting you to your mother, your sister, and the handful of close friends who understand exactly what your day actually looks like from the inside. A quick call in the middle of the afternoon, a shared small complaint, a genuine laugh, a recipe traded back and forth, a bit of local news picked up secondhand. These small, ordinary conversations function as a kind of oxygen, quietly breaking the isolation of a house full of children and entirely absent of any other adult company. That this small lifeline happens to come bundled together with an invisible eavesdropping audience is, in the end, simply the price of admission you accept without much complaint. So you handle the telephone with a careful mixture of genuine gratitude and quiet guardedness, treasuring the connection it offers while measuring your words a little more carefully than you otherwise might, always somewhat aware that a soft click somewhere along the line means someone else has just quietly joined your conversation, invited or not. It is, in its own strange way, your one open window on the wider world, and simultaneously a window straight into everyone else's business as well, both at exactly the same time. You hang the receiver back on its hook eventually, having said just enough and carefully not one word too much, and you turn your attention now to a subject considerably less private than even the party line, and rather more delicate, the matter of the household's money. Here, now, is a genuinely delicate subject, because on paper, at least, the household's daily finances run almost entirely through your own two hands. You are the one who does the shopping, who pays down the running tab at the corner grocer, who knows to the penny what milk costs this week compared to last, and who is expected, quietly but firmly, to stretch every single dollar of the family's budget as though it were made of something considerably more elastic than it actually is. And yet the paycheck itself, the actual source of all this carefully managed money, belongs to your husband, earned at his job downtown, and deposited, more often than not, into a bank account carrying only his name. Depending entirely on the particular man you happen to have married, you might receive a fixed weekly allowance for running the household and comparatively little say in anything much beyond that. Look first at the daily reality of the arrangement, because on this particular front you genuinely do appear, for all the world, to be the household's chief financial officer. You are the one who knows precisely what a roast costs this week compared to last month, and exactly how far a single dollar can reasonably be stretched at the butcher's counter. You handle the weekly shopping, you settle the running account with the corner grocer, and you keep the entire household reliably running on a sum of money that never quite feels like enough, performing small, genuine miracles of careful thrift week after week without complaint. In the daily trenches of ordinary household spending, you are, without any real argument, firmly in charge, the capable manager of a tight and demanding budget, and you have become genuinely skilled at the job, largely because you have never once had the luxury of a real alternative. But look up for a moment from the daily arithmetic, and the wider picture shifts rather sharply, because the actual source of all this money is not you at all. The paycheck belongs entirely to your husband, earned through his own job, and according to the accepted customs of this particular era, it very often lands directly in a bank account bearing only his name, under his sole legal control. A married woman in these years can quite easily find the entire machinery of household money arranged carefully around her husband instead of herself. The bank accounts, any available credit, and every larger financial decision treated, as a matter of ordinary custom, as firmly his domain, with her own position within that arrangement depending rather heavily on his personal goodwill. You manage the money day to day, certainly, but in any legal or practical sense, you do not actually own it, a distinction that can seem small and largely academic right up until, occasionally, it very much is not. How much genuine control you actually hold over the household's finances tends to come down, uncomfortably, to precisely what sort of man you happen to have married. With a generous, fair-minded husband, you might well be handed the weekly housekeeping money freely, and trusted entirely to manage it exactly as you see fit. Even consulted directly on the household's larger financial decisions when they arise. With a more controlling or tight-fisted husband, you might instead receive only a fixed, modest allowance for the entire household, and be expected to account carefully for every single penny spent, with nothing whatsoever set aside for your own personal wants, and any small personal purchase requiring a direct request, a full explanation, and a small, quiet swallowing of your own pride. Two entirely ordinary women living on the very same street, performing the exact same daily work, might in practice be living in two completely different financial worlds, entirely dependent on the particular temperament of the man whose name happens to sit on the bank account. And that is precisely why the small, quiet practice of skimming a little off the top becomes so common across households, and so quietly, universally understood among women without ever needing to be discussed directly. Many a woman shaves a small amount off the weekly grocery money here and there, reports the butcher's bill as very slightly higher than it actually was, and carefully squirrels away that small difference in a jar, a drawer, or the folds of some rarely used serving dish, slowly building up a tiny, private reserve of money that is genuinely, undeniably her own. It is not really dishonesty in any meaningful sense so much as a quiet, practical form of self-defense, a modest way of holding a few dollars that require no permission from anyone, no explanation offered, and certainly no man's prior approval. It is a small, deliberate act of independence, conducted entirely in nickels and dimes, one careful penny at a time. There is, however, one genuinely notable exception to this whole arrangement. One single stream of money that flows directly and reliably into your own hands without any need for permission at all. The federal family allowance, popularly known across the country as the baby bonus, sent by the government each and every month for every child in the household, and crucially, made payable directly to the mother rather than the father. It is not a large sum by any means, only a modest amount per child, but it is genuinely yours, deposited under your own name, spent entirely at your own discretion. And for a great many ordinary women across the country, it stands as the only money in the entire household that owes absolutely nothing to anyone else's goodwill. It is, in its own small, quiet way, a genuinely significant little check, and you will find yourself needing every scrap of the independence it represents, because the wider world, as we will see, still holds a great many additional expectations of you, starting with something as simple and as demanding as how you are expected to look while doing all of this work in the first place. We will pause here for now and pick back up shortly with the constant, quiet pressure to look effortlessly lovely through all of this labor, the arrival of the friendly Avon lady at your front door, and the enormous responsibility of raising several children according to the very latest advice from Dr. Spock. Amid everything we have already covered tonight, there sits one more quiet expectation stacked carefully on top of all the rest, and it is this: through all of this labor, you are also expected to look genuinely lovely while doing it. The magazines, the radio advertisements, the neighbors across the fence, they have all quietly agreed on one particular point, that a good wife greets her husband at the end of his working day looking fresh, pretty, and visibly delighted to see him, as though she has not, in fact, spent the last 9 hours on her knees scrubbing floors and wrestling wet laundry through a wringer. So you find small pockets of stolen time throughout the day to set your hair properly, to mind your figure carefully even while cooking rich, hearty meals for everyone else, to refresh your lipstick before he walks through the door, and to keep your hands looking presentable despite having wrung out what feels like 40 pounds of wet linen just that morning, which, quite honestly, you have. Consider the central, genuinely impossible demand sitting at the heart of all this. You are meant to appear entirely effortless while expending an enormous, sustained amount of actual effort behind the scenes. The ideal woman featured in every advertisement is radiant and perfectly composed, her hair immaculate, her face fresh, her dress entirely uncreased, and she achieves all of this, apparently, through some kind of quiet magic, since no visible labor is ever shown troubling her serene, smiling surface. You, meanwhile, achieve that same appearance of effortless magic through genuine, real work, squeezed carefully into whatever small cracks remain in an already overflowing day, so that the finished result looks, to any outside observer, exactly like nature simply being generous, when in fact it is a second full-time job, quietly layered invisibly on top of the first one. The hair alone represents a standing daily commitment all its own. A proper, presentable set does not simply happen on its own accord. So you sleep, night after night, on hard plastic curlers, or you spend precious stolen minutes with pins and setting spray, gently coaxing your hair into the tidy, wholesome waves the current moment approves of, and then you protect that careful set jealously through the steam of ironing and the honest sweat of scrubbing floors. When the set inevitably falls by afternoon, you simply set it again that evening. A woman with visibly neglected hair is read, rather unfairly, as a woman who has begun letting herself go entirely, which is understood, in the quiet social logic of the neighborhood, to be the first small step down a very short road toward letting everything else go as well. And so the hair is maintained with something close to the vigilance of a soldier carefully polishing his boots before inspection. Then there is the closely related matter of your figure, that quiet, constant pressure to remain slim, trim, and generally pleasing to look at, which sits at the very top of everything else discussed tonight like an unwelcome, ever-present supervisor peering over your shoulder. The magazines are absolutely full of it, the same narrow, ideal silhouette displayed endlessly on every page, and you are somehow meant to meet that standard while simultaneously cooking 3 hearty, generous meals a day for a family that fully expects rich food and entirely clean plates at the end of every sitting. You manage your own portions carefully, minding what you personally eat even as you cook genuine mountains of food for everyone else at the table, and the girdle, discussed earlier tonight, stands ready underneath it all to smooth over whatever quiet, private discipline does not quite manage to handle on its own. The message running underneath all of this is relentless and almost never spoken aloud directly. Your own body, too, is quietly considered part of the household's overall housekeeping. Into this particular corner of your week steps the Avon lady, a small, genuinely bright spot in an otherwise demanding routine, arriving at your front door with her sample case full of creams, powders, and lipsticks, offering you both her products, and just as valuably, a few genuine minutes of friendly adult conversation in the middle of an otherwise solitary day. Beauty is sold to you, quite deliberately, as a small treat, a little pampering, a modest indulgence you are told you genuinely deserve, and there is real, uncomplicated pleasure in it, in trying a new shade of lipstick or a nice cold cream, a rare small permission slip to spend a little money purely on yourself for once. But notice, if you look closely, how neatly the treat doubles quietly as an obligation. How the pampering itself also happens to serve as the ongoing maintenance of a standard you are already required to meet regardless. The gift and the duty, it turns out, arrive wrapped together in precisely the same pretty packaging. So you keep your hands from cracking in the winter cold, your face carefully made up, your hair properly set, and your figure carefully minded, and you present to your husband, each and every evening without exception, the fresh, cheerful wife the era so firmly demands, betraying not the slightest visible sign of the 9 hard hours of physical labor lying quietly behind that practiced, pleasant smile. It is exhausting, in its own particular, quiet way, this constant performance of apparent ease. Even your own face, it turns out, has been carefully folded into the long, endless list of things that must be maintained, and the very same tireless upkeep, as we will see now, is also expected of the small people you happen to be raising, though they, it must be said, are considerably harder to set neatly with pins and a bit of spray. Let's turn our attention now to the children, all several of them at once, because raising them properly is, in a very real sense, understood to be the entire point of this whole demanding arrangement. And absolutely everyone around you seems to hold a firm opinion about exactly how well or poorly you happen to be doing it. Your parenting Bible, sitting on the shelf beside the well-worn cookbook, is Dr. Spock's enormously popular guide to baby and child care, a book that has, over the course of just a few years, quietly convinced an entire generation of mothers across the continent to trust their own instincts more than the stricter, more rigid rules their own mothers followed, while somehow, at the very same time, making them newly anxious about nearly every individual decision along the way. You are managing scraped knees, sibling squabbles, unfinished homework, basic table manners, sudden illnesses, and the general, ongoing chaos of several small people sharing one house. And you are doing almost all of it entirely alone during the long stretch of hours between the school bell ringing and your husband's eventual return home. Start with the sheer number of children involved. Because parenting during this particular baby boom is, quite genuinely, parenting on an entirely different scale than either the generation before or after. You are not carefully shepherding one single, deliberately planned child through a curated, closely observed childhood. You are running a busy, noisy household containing several children spread across a fairly wide range of ages, each one currently at a different stage of need, curiosity, and mischief. The baby needs to be held almost constantly. The toddler needs to be watched every single waking second without exception. The school-aged children need to be fed, gently refereed through their disputes, and helped along with homework, and all of them, without fail, seem to need something from you at precisely the same moment. You being the single available adult on duty for the long, uninterrupted stretch between school letting out and your husband finally walking back through the door. It is considerably less tender, quiet, one-on-one nurturing, and rather more like the cheerful, ongoing crowd control of a very small, very loud institution that never quite closes for the day. Your great standing authority throughout all of this is Dr. Spock, whose thick book on baby and child care now sits on shelves in homes right across the continent, and has, in a fairly short span of years, quietly reshaped how an entire generation of children is being raised. His overall message is warm, and for its time, genuinely, gently revolutionary. Trust yourself, he tells anxious young mothers directly. You already know a good deal more than you might think you do. Be affectionate with your children. Be reasonable with them. Ease off the far more rigid schedules and harsher rules that your own mother's generation followed so strictly. It is, in many respects, genuinely comforting advice. A warm, friendly voice on the printed page quietly reassuring you that your own maternal instincts are fundamentally sound. It is also, in a subtler and less comfortable way, a brand new source of quiet pressure all its own. Because now every single parenting decision is understood to be one you are meant to get right entirely through your own good judgment, and a genuinely difficult child, on a bad day, can start to feel less like ordinary childhood behavior and rather more like a personal verdict on your own adequacy as a mother. The daily practical work of it all is endless and entirely unglamorous. You are simultaneously the nurse who tends carefully to the scraped knee and the sudden fever, the judge who settles the sometimes ferocious disputes over whose turn it is on the swing and who touched whom first, the informal teacher who listens patiently to reading practice and checks over basic arithmetic, and the etiquette instructor steadily drilling please, thank you, and elbows off the table into 4 separate small minds at once. You do all of this standing on your feet throughout the day, while simultaneously cooking, cleaning, and managing the ongoing laundry, your attention constantly split a dozen different directions at once, one ear always quietly cocked for that particular kind of silence that reliably means a child has found something dangerous, or delicious, or occasionally, memorably, both at the same time. Discipline itself falls almost entirely to you to enforce throughout the day, and you enforce it through a careful, practiced mixture of genuine patience, honest weariness, and on the more difficult occasions, the deployment of the household's great strategic reserve. The calm warning that this particular piece of behavior will absolutely be reported to father the moment he returns home this evening. It is, when you stop to think about it, a rather curious arrangement, this quiet outsourcing of final, ultimate authority to a man who was entirely absent for the actual crime, and only arrives home in time for the sentencing. And yet it genuinely holds real power precisely because he is the comparatively rare, serious event in the household's day, while you remain the constant, familiar presence. You would generally rather handle each situation yourself in the moment, and in truth, mostly you do exactly that, saving the heavier artillery of his eventual involvement only for those occasions when your own considerable daily authority has been genuinely, thoroughly exhausted. Through all of this, you are also expected, quietly but firmly, to produce a particular finished product at the end of it all. The era genuinely prizes polite, healthy, well-adjusted children who reflect well on the wider family and who grow steadily into upstanding, respectable citizens. All of this raised carefully on a tight household budget, with genuinely limited outside help, and with what is meant to be an essentially infinite reserve of patience. That patience, it must honestly be admitted, is not actually infinite in any real sense. You have simply become extraordinarily, quietly skilled at convincingly faking it, at holding a calm, steady face over a badly frayed nerve underneath. And the reason there happen to be quite so many small citizens for you to raise in the first place brings us directly to a subject that shapes this entire decade of your life, one the era generally preferred to discuss only in careful, hushed tones when it was discussed at all. The plain truth is this: the Bobbies simply keep arriving. This is, after all, the very height of the baby boom. Reliable methods of birth control remain legally restricted and genuinely difficult to obtain through most of the decade, and large families of this size are, quite simply, the ordinary expectation rather than any kind of exception. So the honest chances are quite good that at any given moment you are either currently pregnant, still physically recovering from a recent pregnancy, or quietly bracing yourself for the next one to begin, often with only a single year or two separating one child from the next. Begin with the underlying reason the Bobbies arrive in such a steady, close procession in the first place, because it is genuinely not, in most cases, entirely a matter of deliberate choice on your part. Through these particular years, the reliable means of preventing pregnancy remain legally restricted in many jurisdictions and are actively discouraged, socially and often religiously. The entire subject wrapped tightly in a fair amount of silence, discomfort, and occasionally outright shame. Clear, practical information on the subject is genuinely scarce, and access to it, where it exists at all, remains difficult, and the kind of open, practical family planning that a later generation will eventually take almost entirely for granted simply does not exist as a realistic option for most ordinary women in your position. Add to this a wider culture that openly celebrates the large, bustling family as the very picture of genuine post-war success and prosperity, and the practical, predictable result follows naturally. Children arrive close together, year after year, whether or not your own body, your household budget, or your own personal spirit happen to feel fully ready for the next one. So your entire adult life, viewed from a certain distance, gradually becomes one long, continuous cycle with pregnancy sitting quietly at its center. You are expecting, or you are physically recovering from a recent birth, or you are currently nursing an infant while quietly already suspecting the next pregnancy may well be on its way. The individual stages steadily blurring together across the full span of the decade with barely a real pause in between any of them. Each individual pregnancy, notably, is carried while you continue performing the entire full range of ordinary household labor, all the cooking, cleaning, hauling, and constant chasing after the children you already have, because the daily work of this household simply does not pause politely for a swelling belly. There is no putting your feet up for a few weeks, no meaningfully lightened workload offered. You simply grow physically larger and steadily more tired, while continuing to do exactly as much as you always have. The actual birth itself has, over the course of these particular years, gradually moved away from the home and into the hospital setting, And this shift is, without question, a genuinely important and welcome one, representing a real, measurable reduction in the dangers that once made childbirth so frequently deadly for both mother and child alike throughout earlier generations. But that improved physical safety has arrived bundled together with a certain new, cold impersonality. Inside the hospital, you become, functionally, a patient, managed and medicated and directed at every stage by a doctor, more often than not a man, while your husband waits somewhere else entirely, packing restlessly in a separate waiting room, because his direct presence at the actual birth is, by the firm custom of the era, neither expected of him nor particularly welcomed by the hospital staff. You labor, in a very real sense, among relative strangers, on their institutional schedule, following their preferred methods, a somewhat strange and sideline participant in what is, after all, the single most intensely physical event of your own entire life. And then comes the part that no cheerful magazine advertisement of the era ever quite thinks to show its readers. There is, quite simply, no real rest waiting for you at the end of it. You come home from the hospital carrying a newborn to a house that has, in your brief absence, continued right on needing absolutely everything from you regardless. To older children who still need feeding, minding, and attention. To a husband who still fully expects his hot supper on the table each evening and his shirts properly pressed each morning. There is no genuine maternity leave available from this particular job, because this job, unlike his, has no formal employer able to grant one, and no substitute worker available anywhere to cover for you while you recover. The physical recovery a birth genuinely demands is, quite simply, a luxury this particular household cannot spare the time or the help to properly accommodate. So you rise again, sore and thoroughly exhausted, and resume the same endless daily work, a brand new baby balanced now on your hip, the very same long day stretching out ahead of you exactly as it always has. The cumulative toll of carrying all of this, year after year without real pause, is genuinely enormous, and largely, quietly unspoken by anyone around you. It is a real physical and emotional weight that the cheerful public image of post-war motherhood politely, consistently declines to mention anywhere. You love these children fiercely, and entirely genuinely, and at the very same time you are honestly worn thin by the sheer relentlessness of bearing and raising them in such close succession, with so little real pause and so very little outside help along the way. Real, proper rest becomes, over these years, a concept you mainly encounter secondhand, in the very same glossy magazines that keep quietly piling the expectations higher with every issue. And that quiet, steadily mounting exhaustion, the particular kind no one around you is really supposed to name out loud in polite company, leads us naturally into a corner of this decade's life that the era worked especially hard to keep carefully hidden from view. We will pause here for now, and continue shortly with the quiet, unspoken toll all of this takes on a woman's own mental and emotional well-being, the era's particular language of nerves, and the genuine lifeline offered by the other women scattered up and down your own street. Let's turn, gently, to something the era generally preferred not to discuss out loud at all, because underneath the isolation of the new suburbs, the genuinely relentless daily workload, and the constant social pressure to appear endlessly cheerful about all of it, a great many ordinary women found themselves quietly exhausted, anxious, and unhappy in a way that had, at the time, no fully acceptable name to describe it. You could hardly announce at a dinner party that the dream house and the shiny new appliances somehow left you feeling strangely hollow inside. So instead, like countless other women on your street, you simply had nerves. Understand first how genuinely airtight this particular trap was, because that is really what made the whole weight of it so heavy to carry. On the outside, your life looks, by every visible measure the era offers, exactly like the picture of quiet success the entire country has collectively agreed to want. The tidy, well-kept house, the healthy, well-mannered children, the steadily employed, hardworking husband, The modern appliances humming away contentedly in nearly every room. You are supposed to be happy. By every standard the era openly measures a woman by, you have been given everything a woman is generally told to want. And so if you happen to feel tired straight down to the bone, or quietly lonely, or gradually flattened by a certain sameness stretching endlessly toward the horizon, there is genuinely no fully acceptable way to say so out loud, because saying so would risk sounding deeply ungrateful for a life the entire surrounding culture insists, loudly and repeatedly, is the dream itself. So the feeling, denied any open outlet, quietly goes underground and takes on a rather more socially acceptable shape instead. You do not say, in plain words, that you are genuinely unhappy. You say instead that you are feeling a little run down lately, or that you have had a persistent headache, or that your nerves have simply been bad today. That particular word, nerves, does a remarkable amount of quiet work throughout these years. It functions as a small, respectable container for a considerably larger, largely unnameable thing sitting underneath it. A socially acceptable way to gesture toward genuine exhaustion, sadness, and quiet desperation, without ever having to call any of it by its more honest name. It lets an ordinary woman openly admit that she is struggling, while still allowing everyone around her, herself included, to comfortably pretend the struggle is purely a matter of a somewhat delicate personal constitution, rather than a perfectly reasonable, entirely predictable response to a genuinely unreasonable daily load. When the nerves eventually become too difficult to quietly hide any longer, the road generally leads to the family doctor, and the doctor, almost always a man himself in this particular era, receives you kindly enough and reaches, quite naturally, for the standard tools of his own time and training. He might offer you a mild tonic, a sedative, something gentle enough to take the sharp edge off and help you rest a little more easily at night, along with some quiet, well-meant reassurance and a gentle suggestion that you might simply try to slow down a little and count your various blessings. It is, in most cases, genuinely well-intentioned, and it does address the surface of the problem to some degree. It can quiet the more obvious symptoms, smooth over the sharpest edges, and get you reasonably back on your feet and back to the work waiting for you at home. What it does not do, and what it was never really designed to do in the first place, is pause to ask whether the underlying shape of the life itself might actually be the thing pressing down so heavily on you in the first place. Because that particular question happens to be exactly the one the whole surrounding arrangement is quietly built to avoid asking. The genuine possibility that the real trouble is not some private flaw located inside you personally, but rather a flaw built directly into the design of the situation itself, that any human being asked to labor continuously without any real pause, without pay, without much company or credit, might quite reasonably, quite understandably, come apart a little at the seams eventually, is simply not a question placed anywhere on the table for serious discussion. It is, after all, a great deal easier for everyone involved to quietly soothe one individual woman at a time than it would be to seriously question an entire, deeply established way of living shared by nearly everyone around her. And so the trouble stays quietly located in you, in your particular nerves, your individual constitution, your apparent personal failure to properly appreciate your own considerable good fortune, and never ever, in the actual design of a life that so thoroughly isolates and exhausts so very many women at exactly the same time, all across the same quiet streets. You take the tonic, or perhaps you politely decline it, and you accept the doctor's kind advice as it is offered, and you rise again the very next morning to do it all over, because the children still need feeding regardless, and the floors still need scrubbing regardless, and this particular world has, as yet, no real space carved out anywhere for a housewife who simply, quietly stops. So the ache stays largely quiet and unnamed, carried patiently alongside the weekly laundry and the daily meals, one more invisible item on an already very long list. Thank goodness, then, for the other women, because they are, In a very real and practical sense, the reason you manage to stay genuinely sane through all of this. Out here in the newer suburbs especially, the days can grow desperately lonely if left entirely unbroken. One woman alone in a house with several small children while the men vanish downtown to the city each morning, taking with them the car, the paycheck, and nearly all available adult conversation for the day. So you find each other, quite naturally, sometime around mid-morning, once the worst of the day's chores have been at least temporarily beaten back into submission. Start with the loneliness itself, because the whole tradition of gathering only really makes sense once you understand what it is answering. The new post-war suburbs are built, almost by design, around a fairly simple, quietly isolating pattern. The men leave together each morning for the city and its various offices, taking the family car and most of the day's adult company along with them, while the women remain behind, each one largely confined to her own individual house, each one occupied with her own children, scattered thinly across otherwise quiet daytime streets like a series of small, separate islands. There are no coworkers nearby, no shared lunchroom, none of the built-in, casual human contact that an ordinary outside job naturally provides. Simply you, the children, and the long, largely silent hours of the day stretching out ahead. The answer women across this era quietly invented for themselves, almost without any formal planning at all, is beautifully, practically simple. They gather. Once the worst of the morning's chores have been beaten back into some rough kind of temporary order, you cross over to a neighbor's kitchen, or she crosses over to yours instead, and a small, familiar ritual unfolds naturally around a fresh pot of coffee and whatever cake or squares happen to be on hand that particular morning. The children play together underfoot or nap quietly in another room nearby, and the women simply sit and talk freely for a while. And for that one stolen hour, the day's isolation genuinely lifts a little. This particular gathering, often called the coffee klatch by the women themselves, unfolds quietly in kitchen after kitchen up and down the street. A small, entirely informal institution that ends up holding the whole lonely daily arrangement together far more than anyone officially acknowledges. Do not mistake it for mere idle chatter, though there is, admittedly, a good deal of thoroughly enjoyable chatter woven throughout it. Yes, there is gossip, the latest news of the street traded back and forth and turned over with genuine relish and interest, and there is nothing particularly wrong with that, because gossip, examined honestly, also functions as real, useful information, a practical way of quietly knowing who on the street might currently need a bit of help, and who seems to be struggling more than she is letting on, and what is really going on behind various tidy front doors up and down the block. But there is a good deal more besides the gossip alone. There is hard-won practical advice, freely offered and freely received, on colicky bobbies, stubborn laundry stains, and occasionally difficult husbands. There is real commiseration, the genuine, deep relief of hearing another woman openly admit that she feels exactly the same way you do about all of it. There are recipes traded, sewing patterns shared, and outgrown children's clothes passed comfortably along from one family to the next. It is, in every meaningful sense, a genuine support system, one with no official name and no formal budget behind it whatsoever, running entirely on shared coffee and simple mutual need. Above everything else, there is a kind of quiet recognition offered, which may well be the single thing you crave most and receive least often anywhere else in your daily life. Your own husband does not really see the true scope of the work involved in running this house. The magazines only ever seem to scold you toward some impossible standard. The wider world at large simply treats what you do all day as invisible and entirely automatic. But the woman sitting across the kitchen table from you sees it clearly, precisely because she is, at this very moment, doing the identical work inside an identical kind of house just down the street. And when your eyes happen to meet hers over a shared complaint about the wringer, or the ironing, or a particular child's dramatic tantrum, there passes between you a real, unspoken understanding that requires no further explanation at all. You are genuinely known here, in a way you are barely known almost anywhere else in your daily life. That quiet recognition, honestly, is worth considerably more than the coffee itself, and the coffee, it should be said, is genuinely quite good as well. So this daily or near-daily coffee klatch is not, in any real sense, a frivolous way of simply filling idle time, of which you have, in truth, almost none to spare. It is, quite genuinely, a lifeline, a daily or near-daily act of collective survival, ordinary women quietly propping one another up because, for the most part, no one else around them is doing it for them. It costs nothing at all in money, and it holds together a great deal more than it might first appear to from the outside. And out of these same warm, talkative kitchens grows something rather more enterprising, a way the women on your street have found to turn their casual daily gatherings into a little something more, complete with games, small prizes, and a genuinely suspicious quantity of new plastic containers. Out of that whole familiar world of neighborly gathering grows one of the decade's cleverest small inventions, the home sales party. Someone on the street hosts, everyone nearby comes along, and the evening's entertainment turns out, rather improbably, to be the enthusiastic buying and selling of plastic kitchen containers. A well-known brand's home party transforms your own living room, for one evening, into an impromptu showroom, complete with small party games, modest prizes, and a genuinely peppy live demonstration of exactly how these remarkable, tightly sealed lids are about to change your daily kitchen life for the better. Similar home party arrangements exist for selling cosmetics, cookware, and household cleaning products, all of it pitched carefully, woman to woman, directly inside the home, over coffee and a plate of refreshments. Picture the scene for a moment, because it really is a small marvel of quiet social engineering. A hostess opens her own front door, invites the women of the neighborhood in, and lays out coffee and a few refreshments. And into this already warm, familiar gathering steps the visiting saleswoman with her sample case of goods. There are small games first, silly and genuinely fun, with modest little prizes handed out to keep the overall mood light and social. And then comes the main demonstration itself, an enthusiastic little performance in which the sealable plastic containers are shown off proudly in all their considerable glory. The now famous lids pressed firmly down and given their signature little burp to prove, beyond any doubt, their genuinely airtight seal. It is part sales pitch, part social party, part community event, and it is aimed with real precision, directly at exactly the audience already gathered comfortably in that particular living room. The real genius of the whole arrangement is that it quietly takes the existing coffee klatch, something the women were already doing together anyway, and gently attaches a cash register to it without disrupting the underlying friendship at all. The setting stays warm and thoroughly familiar. The company remains close friends and neighbors. The sales pressure itself stays soft and purely social, rather than hard and overtly commercial. And so the buying itself comes to feel considerably less like ordinary shopping, and rather more like simply joining in with everyone else. Who, after all, genuinely wants to be the one woman at the party who did not want the clever new containers everyone else in the room is happily admiring? The entire model runs almost entirely on existing friendship and a very mild, entirely pleasant sense of social obligation. And it manages, in the process, to move a genuinely astonishing amount of merchandise while doing it. This same basic trick powers a whole small ecosystem of home-based selling across the country. Cosmetics arrive at your own front door and at these same casual parties. Cookware gets demonstrated live in a neighbor's kitchen. Cleaning products get discussed and sold over squares and fresh coffee. All of it sold, consistently, woman to woman, inside private homes, moving through the exact same existing web of female friendship that already holds the street together. The companies behind all of this figured out something genuinely shrewd fairly early on, that the isolated suburban housewife made both a perfect customer and, at the very same time, a perfect saleswoman, already embedded deeply inside exactly the social network best positioned to move their goods, and they built their entire sales approach carefully around exactly that insight. And here, quietly, sits the part of all this that matters rather more than the plastic containers themselves ever really could. For the particular woman doing the actual selling, hosting these parties, and earning a modest commission from them, this represents one of the very few genuinely, broadly socially acceptable ways available to her to earn a bit of money entirely of her own. She is not, technically, taking an outside job, which might otherwise raise uncomfortable questions among the neighbors about her husband's ability to properly provide for the family. She is simply having a bit of fun with friends, simply being sociable, simply helping out a little with some extra pin money on the side. But the money earned is entirely real, and so, quietly, is the small accompanying taste of genuine independence that comes with it, the accounts kept carefully in her own name, the earnings that answer to absolutely no one's prior allowance or approval. So you go along to these parties, and you occasionally host one yourself, and you come home afterward with considerably more sealable plastic containers than any reasonable kitchen genuinely needs. And you tell yourself, quite honestly, that you mainly went for the company, which happens to be entirely true. But watch closely the particular woman actually running the show that evening, the one holding the sample case and the order book, and you may catch a brief, quiet glimpse of something this era rarely allowed women to hold openly and without apology. A small measure of their own money, and a small measure of their own reach into the wider world beyond the kitchen. Whatever a woman may privately feel about all of this, appearances, as we have discussed at length tonight, must always be carefully maintained. And few institutions on this street matter quite as much to those appearances as the local church does, particularly on a Sunday morning. Sunday means the entire family gets scrubbed thoroughly, pressed neatly, and marched together to the family pew. You in your good hat and matching gloves. The children rendered, at least temporarily, terrifyingly clean. Your husband looking, for one morning at least, like a man who has genuinely never once slept through a crying baby in his life. Beyond the church service itself, this particular institution functions as the true social backbone of the entire surrounding community. Begin with the Sunday morning production itself, because it really is its own small logistical triumph, achieved fresh every single week without fail. Getting a large family properly churchworthy means bathing and dressing every single child in their designated best clothes, kept specially clean all week for exactly this one purpose, wrestling the smaller ones into stiff collars and freshly polished shoes, seeing carefully to your own hair and face to the required standard, and turning yourself out properly in your good hat and gloves. Because a genuinely respectable lady simply does not enter a church either bareheaded or looking anything less than perfectly composed. Your husband, for his part, appears calm, well-rested, and thoroughly dignified, the very picture of a solid, capable family man, an image you have, in fact, carefully constructed for him using the very same two hands that were already up and working hours before dawn. The whole family, assembled together and gleaming, files as one neat, polished unit into the family pew, and that unit itself sends a clear message. One, every single member of the congregation is entirely fluent in reading correctly. A family arriving together, well-dressed, well-behaved, and reliably on time, week after week without exception, announces itself quietly but unmistakably as decent, stable, and thoroughly upstanding, precisely the kind of family that genuinely belongs here. The children's scrubbed faces testify silently to your diligence as a mother. The crisply pressed shirts testify to your care as a wife. The simple, consistent fact of weekly attendance testifies to your overall virtue as a woman. Church, in this particular sense, functions as the place where respectability is publicly performed, and just as publicly witnessed, a weekly opportunity for the whole street to see clearly that all is genuinely well behind your own particular front door, whether or not that happens to be entirely true underneath the surface. For a great many women, of course, the underlying faith itself is entirely genuine and quite deep, a real source of comfort, and meaning running through an often hard and uncertain daily life. And none of the social performance discussed above cancels any of that out. You may pray with complete sincerity, find genuine solace in the familiar hymns and the steady ritual, and lean honestly on your own belief to get through the more exhausting weeks. The spiritual and the social sit comfortably side by side in the very same pew, sincere devotion and careful outward appearance woven together so tightly that trying to pull the two apart would prove a strange and largely pointless exercise. You can mean every single word of the service sincerely, and also remain acutely aware, the entire time, of exactly who around you happens to be watching. Beyond the Sunday service itself, the church functions as the genuine beating social heart of the wider community, and a great deal of that heart runs on the largely unpaid labor of women very much like yourself. There are the regular bake sales and bazaars, the ladies' auxiliary and the various guild committees, the endless volunteer work that quietly keeps the whole broader institution running smoothly week after week. And it is, overwhelmingly, the women who take on the lion's share of this ongoing work, organizing, cooking, cleaning, arranging, holding the entire community together with the same largely unpaid labor they already use to hold their own individual homes together. It represents real influence of a genuine kind, a space where women's practical competence is clearly needed and openly felt. Even as the formal, official authority up at the pulpit itself remains firmly and exclusively in male hands throughout the decade, and everywhere always, quietly running underneath all of it, there is the watching, the great constant engine driving so much of small town or suburban social life. Everyone quietly observing everyone else, noting carefully who came this week and who did not, whose children happened to fidget through the sermon, whose hat looked freshly new, whose family seemed just slightly frayed at the edges this particular Sunday. Those watching eyes keep everyone gently, consistently in line, the simple knowledge that any visible slip will be seen, remembered, and quietly discussed, enforcing the community's unwritten standards considerably more effectively than any formal rule ever could. So you dress the entire family carefully, fill the family pew, sing the familiar hymns, and pass inspection once again. One more ordinary Sunday among a great many others stretching both behind you and ahead. That very same exhausting performance of a flawless, well-run household reaches its single most nerve-wracking pitch on the particular evening your husband decides to invite his boss home for dinner. Sooner or later, in nearly every household on the street, comes the evening that genuinely tests every single skill you happen to possess, all at exactly the same time. Your husband announces that he has invited his boss and the boss's wife over for dinner. This is not, in any meaningful sense, a purely social occasion. This is, quite plainly, an audition, and your husband's entire future career prospects are sitting right there on the menu, positioned somewhere directly beside the roast. The house, naturally, must be rendered absolutely immaculate. The children must be scrubbed thoroughly, and then, at the right moment, made to quietly vanish from sight. The good china comes carefully down from wherever it normally lives between rare special occasions, and you must produce, apparently effortlessly, a genuinely impressive multi-course meal while privately, quietly panicking the entire time back in the kitchen. Understand clearly what is actually being served tonight, because it genuinely is not simply the roast. When the boss comes to dinner, the entire household itself is placed on quiet display, and the household, according to the accepted logic of this particular era, is understood to be a direct reflection of the man who formally heads it. A gracious, well-run home, a lovely, composed wife, a genuinely fine meal, and well-behaved children all combine to tell the visiting boss, without a single word needing to be spoken aloud, that your husband is stable, capable, and precisely the sort of steady, reliable family man who genuinely deserves that upcoming raise or promotion, or simply continued professional trust. In other words, your performance this particular evening gets quietly folded directly into your husband's ongoing career, and everyone seated at that table knows it perfectly well, even though not one person present would ever actually say so out loud. The preparation for this single evening becomes a genuine campaign waged carefully over several preceding days. The house must be cleaned even beyond its usual already high standard, every surface left gleaming, every stray object carefully tucked away out of sight, the whole place arranged to look convincingly as though no ordinary domestic chaos has ever once occurred within these walls. The good dishes come down from wherever they normally live between grand occasions. The good linens get carefully pressed. The silver gets thoroughly polished. You plan the entire menu the way a careful general might plan an important battle, selecting dishes impressive enough to clearly signal genuine effort, yet reliable enough that they will not risk betraying you at some crucial moment. And you shop and cook and prepare with the real stakes quietly humming away in the back of your mind the entire time. The children present their own particular, delicate problem to solve. They must be scrubbed, dressed neatly, and briefly produced as clear evidence of your genuinely fine mothering, polite and charming for exactly as long as it takes to make a suitably good impression. And then they must promptly vanish again, whisked quietly away and settled comfortably elsewhere so the adults can properly dine together in peace. Orchestrating this careful appearance and disappearance, timing it precisely so that no toddler happens to melt down over the soup course, and no school-aged child says something accidentally mortifying about the family's actual everyday life, is a genuine feat of stage management that would not look at all out of place in professional theater. You are, quite literally, directing a small production in which the principal actors are young, unpredictable, and entirely your own. Then comes the actual evening itself, the real performance carried out under the lights. You cook steadily, you serve gracefully, you clear plates quietly, you refill glasses attentively. You charm the boss's wife with easy conversation and laugh warmly at the boss's jokes. You keep every single course arriving both hot and precisely on time. And you accomplish all of it while radiating the calm, serene impression that this is simply how your household always, effortlessly operates, entirely graceful and warm without the slightest visible strain. Meanwhile, behind the closed kitchen door, you are moving at something close to a dead sprint, managing a dozen separate small crises at once, your heart racing the entire time, betraying not one hint of it whenever you glide calmly back out into the dining room with the next course and an easy smile. It is, in every real sense, a genuine masterclass in grace under considerable pressure, performed for an audience that must never once suspect the pressure exists at all. And when the evening is finally, mercifully over, when the boss and his wife have gone home and your husband sits glowing quietly with the evening's evident success, there is no applause waiting for you, and certainly no rest either, because the immaculate house of an hour ago is now a genuine wreck of dirty dishes, and the good silver, unfortunately, will not wash itself. You will be standing in the kitchen long after everyone else in the house has gone happily off to bed, scrubbing out the roasting pan that helped, in its own small way, to win your husband's professional advancement tonight. A quiet triumph that will, naturally, be credited entirely to him alone. We will pause here for now, and continue shortly with the small, precious pockets of leisure actually available to you in the evenings, the radio and the arrival of television, the great mail-order catalog known affectionately as the Wish Book, and finally, as the night draws toward its close, the quiet, restless question so many women on this street were beginning, privately, to ask themselves. By now you may well be wondering when exactly in the course of a day like this you are actually meant to relax, and the honest answer is, mostly in the small cracks between everything else, and even then, not entirely. Your leisure, such as it is, tends to arrive woven directly into the work itself rather than carved out as any separate block of time. Let's begin with the radio, your faithful daytime companion, murmuring away steadily in the corner of the kitchen while you work through the long stretch of the afternoon. It brings music to scrub the floor by, news of a wider world you rarely have occasion to actually see for yourself. And best of all, a whole slate of programs made expressly for women who happen to be home during the day. The serial dramas that slowly unspool their endless plots, one 15-minute episode at a time. The homemaking programs offering recipes and gentle advice in a warm, friendly voice. It fills the silence of an otherwise empty daytime house, offers a small thread of company and ongoing story through the long solitary hours, and asks nothing at all of you in return, except that you keep listening while your hands stay busy with whatever task is currently in front of you. It is, in its own quiet way, leisure that does not actually interrupt the labor, which happens to be the only kind of leisure you are really permitted in the first place. Then, sometime around the middle of this decade, comes an arrival that genuinely changes the shape of the evening for households across the country. The television set, glowing to life for the first time in living rooms right across Canada as broadcasting takes hold, and a set gradually appears in more and more homes with each passing year. It is, by any honest measure, a genuine wonder, moving pictures brought directly into your own front room, and it draws the whole family together each evening to sit before its flickering screen in a way nothing else previously quite managed. The entire household gathers around it, and this shared evening viewing quickly becomes a brand new domestic ritual, something like a modern hearth, everyone's face lit faintly blue in the darkened room. But notice, because you certainly will notice, how differently that same evening actually sits for you compared to everyone else gathered in the room. Your husband settles comfortably into his favorite chair after supper, his working day already well behind him, entirely free to give himself over fully to the newspaper and then the evening's programs. The children sprawl out comfortably on the floor and simply watch. And you, technically present in the very same room, are rarely ever just watching, because your hands are almost always still occupied with mending or darning or folding laundry, the evening's supposed leisure quietly doubling as one more small shift of ongoing work. You are in the room, and you are watching too after a fashion, but you also remain, in every practical sense, still on duty, because a woman sitting with genuinely idle hands is simply not a thing this particular era knows quite how to picture comfortably. That really is the heart of the matter. True leisure, the kind where you do absolutely nothing at all and feel no accompanying guilt about that nothing, remains for you largely a rumor rather than a regular experience. You have certainly heard that it exists somewhere. You have watched your own husband practice it, sinking comfortably into his chair and simply being unbothered, unproductive, genuinely at rest. But for you there is always, without exception, something that could reasonably be done instead, and a lifetime of quiet training insisting firmly that it probably should be. So that even sitting down to watch a program in the evening comes bundled automatically, with a basket of socks needing darning, resting neatly on your lap the whole time like a small, quiet debt still owed. So you take your own leisure the same way you take nearly everything else in this life, on the run, woven directly into the tasks themselves, snatched in whatever small cracks appear between them, a program half-watched over a growing pile of mending, a magazine flipped through quickly while something simmers gently on the stove behind you. It is not, in the end, entirely nothing, this stitched-together version of rest, and you are honestly grateful for whatever small measure of it you can find. But you do notice, on certain evenings more than others, that your husband's evening and your own evening are unfolding in the very same room, at the very same hour, and are, in every meaningful sense, simply not the same evening at all. Even your rarer hours of genuine ease, when they come, tend to arrive by mail order and catalog, which brings us naturally to the great thick book that quietly runs so much of ordinary Canadian life during this decade. For all the newer supermarkets and shops springing up steadily in the country's growing towns, a genuinely enormous share of Canadian life still arrives reliably by mail, thanks largely to the mighty mail-order catalog. The catalog, affectionately nicknamed the Wish Book by nearly everyone who uses it, sits as a fixture in homes right across the entire country, especially out on the farms and in more remote communities sitting far from any proper store. Within its many pages, you can order clothing, furniture, tools, toys, fabric by the yard, and very nearly anything else your household might need. All of it delivered directly to your own door or to the nearest railway station for collection. Understand first the sheer geography that makes this particular catalog so genuinely powerful, because this remains a vast, thinly settled country in many respects. For every family living comfortably in a bustling town with real shops lining the street, there are a great many more families scattered across distant farms and small, remote communities, hours away from anything resembling a proper store, where a genuine shopping trip into the city is a rare and fairly major expedition requiring real planning. For these particular households, the catalog functions as considerably more than a mere convenience. It is, quite simply, the store itself, the one genuinely reliable way to purchase the 100 small things a family regularly needs that the local outpost simply does not stock. It brings the entire national marketplace directly to the kitchen table, no matter how far that particular table happens to sit from anywhere resembling a city. And what a marketplace it genuinely is, packed tightly between those thick covers. You can order clothing for every single member of the family, boots, coats, Sunday dresses, and also furniture, tools, fabric by the yard, kitchenware, toys for the children, farm supplies, very nearly anything a person could reasonably want or need. You pore carefully over the pages, and the wish book earns its rather affectionate nickname honestly, because poring over it really is half daydream in practice, circling the coat you would genuinely love to own, considering new curtains for the front room, imagining the particular toy that would light up a child's face on Christmas morning, picturing the household as it might look if the weekly budget happened to stretch just a little further than it currently does. The whole ritual carries its own particular, patient rhythm, slow in a way that would genuinely baffle a much later, faster generation of shoppers. You study the pages carefully, make your considered choices weighed honestly against the available money, fill out the order form by hand, and send it off. And then you wait, days stretching gradually into weeks, for the goods to slowly make their way to your own front door or to the nearest railway station for you to collect in person. When the parcel finally does arrive, it becomes a small, genuine event in its own right. A little burst of anticipation finally, properly rewarded, the ordered items unwrapped carefully and examined closely before being put immediately to use. There is no instant gratification available here at all, only the older, quieter pleasure of genuinely looking forward to something for a good while, and then, eventually, actually receiving it. For you in particular, the catalog offers something quietly valuable that is fairly hard to come by elsewhere. A genuine measure of choice exercised entirely on your own terms, without any shopkeeper hovering nearby, without needing to arrange a trip into town, without requiring a car you likely cannot borrow in the first place. Sitting comfortably at your own kitchen table, you can consider carefully, compare thoughtfully, and decide entirely for yourself, effectively shopping the whole country's available goods at your own unhurried pace, from within your own kitchen. It is a small measure of genuine autonomy, a bit of real control over exactly what comes into your home, and in a life where so very much is already dictated for you and comparatively little is freely chosen on your own terms, that particular page-turning freedom is honestly not nothing at all. And then, in keeping with the era's deep and genuine tradition of thrift, the old wish book enjoys a humble second career of its own once its pages finally fall out of date. Nothing genuinely useful is ever truly wasted in a household like this one, and a thick catalog full of soft, absorbent paper is considered far too valuable simply to throw away. So the previous year's edition inevitably migrates out to the outhouse, where it performs one final, thoroughly practical and thoroughly Canadian service, from dream book straight down to plain necessity, right down to its very last page. Waste not, as the old saying goes, and want not. Now, with the evening well advanced and the family finally settled in front of the television, the day's work does not, in fact, end there, because now begins what might fairly be called the second shift, a stretch of the evening that officially belongs to nobody's job description at all. There are baths to be run for the children, hair to be toweled dry, small teeth to be brushed properly, a bedtime story to be read aloud, evening prayers to be said quietly together, and several small, sleepy people to be coaxed, one by one, into their own beds and, crucially, actually kept there through the night. Begin with the bedtime campaign itself, because it genuinely is a full, small military operation, conducted while you are already running on very little reserve energy left over from the day. Several children must be bathed in turn, itself a wet, physically demanding little production, then dried thoroughly and combed, small teeth brushed carefully, a story read through in full, prayers heard and gently corrected where needed, and then the long, patient negotiation of actually getting each child to stay properly in their own bed follows immediately after. Each one, without fail, requires one more drink of water, one more trip to the bathroom, one more small question asked, one more quiet reassurance offered about the dark corners of the room. You move steadily from child to child, settling each one in turn, and the whole slow, patient process quietly consumes the first full hour or more of an evening you had perhaps foolishly hoped might eventually become your own. With the children finally, genuinely settled and the house gone properly quiet at last, you might reasonably think the day's work is now essentially finished. But the kitchen, of course, is still patiently waiting, and the kitchen remains thoroughly unforgiving of any delay. There are the supper dishes still to be washed, dried, and carefully put away, the pots scrubbed clean, the counters wiped down properly, the floor swept once more of the day's final scattering of crumbs. And even as you finish this last stretch of cleaning, your mind is already quietly running ahead toward tomorrow, because tomorrow's breakfast must be roughly planned tonight, and tomorrow's packed lunches thought through in advance, and the small necessary preparations made this evening that will let you properly launch the whole family on schedule again at dawn. In a very real sense, the end of today's work functions mainly as the setup for tomorrow's beginning. Then there is, almost always, some remaining backlog waiting quietly in the wings, the smaller tasks that got pushed aside during the day's ordinary chaos and now finally come due in these last, quiet evening hours. The mending basket sits there, still full of small tears and missing buttons needing attention. The ironing you did not quite manage to finish earlier waits patiently for your renewed attention. There is nearly always some chore or other that the busy daylight hours simply could not properly accommodate, saved instead for the evening, because the evening happens to be the only remaining slack left over in a day that otherwise has none at all. So your supposed rest hours quietly fill back up with precisely the work the actual working hours of the day could not fully hold. The underlying labor does not genuinely end at any fixed point. It simply relocates itself to wherever there happens to be a body still awake in the house to carry it out. Meanwhile, cast a brief glance across the room at exactly how your husband is spending this very same evening hour, because the contrast between the two of you really does tell the whole quiet story on its own. He has settled comfortably into his chair with the newspaper and the flickering television screen, his own working day having concluded hours earlier at the office door behind him. He is genuinely free now to rest properly, to simply be entertained, to do essentially nothing at all with a perfectly clear conscience. His evening is straightforward leisure. Your evening is this same second shift, an entire additional workday quietly stacked directly on top of the first one. Invisible to nearly everyone and entirely uncounted by anyone keeping score, performed while he relaxes comfortably not 10 feet away from where you are working. The two of you are both technically home, in the very same house, at exactly the same hour, and yet you are living through two entirely different nights side by side. And so you move quietly through the gradually darkening house, finishing off the last remaining tasks one by one, switching off the lights room by room as you go, the last person still awake tonight, just as you were also the very first person up this morning. This, in essence, is the true shape of your ordinary day at both of its ends. You open it in the cold and dark, well before anyone else in the house stirs, and you close it again in the quiet dark, well after everyone else has already fallen asleep. The two bookends of a labor that never quite seems to fully stop anywhere in between. You climb, at long last, into your own bed, genuinely bone-tired, fully aware that the baby may well wake again before long, and that the entire cycle will simply begin all over again in just a few short hours. And in that final, drowsy, half-waking moment before sleep finally takes you, sometimes a small and rather dangerous question quietly drifts up through the exhaustion. Because here you are, after all, living inside the very house you were promised, quite sincerely, would make you genuinely happy, surrounded by the shiny new appliances, the healthy children, and the tidy suburban dream you were told to want. And yet, a great many women, considerably more than anyone around them ever openly admitted, found themselves lying awake at night quietly wondering whether this really was, in fact, all there truly was to look forward to. Perhaps you had an education once that you never really got the chance to properly use. Perhaps you had ambitions once, quietly and politely set aside somewhere along the way. Perhaps you have a mind that still feels genuinely hungry for something the kitchen alone was never quite able to fully satisfy. Sit with that particular strangeness for just a moment, the way real discontent can genuinely coexist, side by side, with real and undeniable good fortune. You are not going hungry. You are not left out in the cold. You are not in any obvious immediate danger. You have a decent, solid house, a steadily employed husband, healthy children, precisely the kind of comforts your own mother and grandmother could, in their own time, only have dreamed of having for themselves. And an entire surrounding society keeps assuring you, at every turn, that this is, in fact, the intended happy ending, the promised reward, the very thing every woman is supposed to genuinely want above all else. And still, in the quiet of the night, some small part of you feels unaccountably restless, somehow unfed, as though something genuinely essential has been quietly left out of a life that otherwise appears, on paper at least, to have absolutely everything it is supposed to have. The real trouble, when you look at it honestly, is not that the promised dream itself failed to arrive. It is that the dream actually did arrive, precisely as promised, and simply turned out in the end to be somewhat smaller than you yourself actually were. Think for a moment of everything many women quietly set aside in order to arrive here in the first place. Some genuinely had real educations behind them, sharp, capable minds that shone clearly back in school, real ambitions once to become something more, to do meaningful work out in the wider world, to properly use a talent that had, on the surface at least, very little to do with any kitchen. And then came marriage, and then children, exactly as everyone around them had always quietly known it eventually would, along with the firm custom of the era insisting that a wife's proper place was firmly at home. And so those earlier ambitions were carefully folded up and quietly put away, mostly without any real drama at all, because that, quite simply, was understood to be what one did. The mind itself, of course, did not simply stop being hungry the moment it was told firmly that it was already full. It only, gradually, stopped being properly fed, and the various doors leading back out toward something more remained, for the time being, mostly closed. To take on real paid work once married was actively discouraged in most circles, read by others as a quiet, unfortunate sign that your husband could not properly provide for the family, a small but genuine public embarrassment. Independence, whether of money, of movement, or of simple everyday choice, remained genuinely hard to come by within a world so thoroughly arranged around the man's paycheck and the woman's home. The available paths a restless, genuinely capable woman might otherwise have taken toward some larger, fuller life were narrow, comparatively few, and often lined quietly with social disapproval, so that even the simple act of wanting something more could start to feel in itself almost like a personal fault, a kind of quiet ingratitude, A failure to properly be the contented, satisfied wife the era's unwritten rule book so firmly demanded of her. That particular wanting, denied any real outlet, had nowhere else left to go, and so it gradually turned inward instead, becoming that quiet, familiar ache sitting in the dark. But here is the important thing about that particular ache, the real reason it genuinely matters beyond any single woman's individual sleepless night. You are honestly not the only one feeling it. In houses up and down your own street, across your entire town, across the whole wide country, other women are lying awake at this very same hour with that very same unnamed restlessness, each one quietly believing herself to be entirely alone in feeling it, each one keeping it politely, carefully to herself. It is spreading quietly from kitchen to kitchen, a shared and largely silent question steadily gathering real weight underneath the surface, and although almost no one is saying it plainly out loud just yet, that particular silence will not in fact last forever. In the years still ahead, women very much like you will slowly begin to say it plainly, and that plain, honest speaking will, in time, change a great many things. But that particular story properly belongs to another night entirely. For tonight, simply let the question drift quietly wherever it wishes to go. Pull the quilt up snugly against the cold, listen to the old furnace ticking gently away down in the basement, and feel the whole house settle comfortably around you, every single person in it currently asleep because of the steady, patient work of your own two hands, work that will, without question, quietly begin all over again well before the sun properly rises tomorrow. And with that thought, gentler now than bitter, you finally let your own tired eyes close for the night, one weary, genuinely remarkable woman among a great many others, sinking at last into a well-earned rest.